Hi, I'm Carlin Borisenko. In early 2020, I was the knitting Democrat who accidentally went viral on the internet for going to a Trump rally and then left the party. I became the conservative darling, was on all the shows, traveled around the country, and then realized that conservatives were no better than Democrats. If there's one thing that I've learned, it's that both political tribes are two sides of the same coin. But it wasn't all bad. On my journey, I became obsessed with understanding the woke ideology and the culture war. I broke the story of the city of Seattle doing segregated training with its employees.
How bad has this stuff become? The city of Seattle has now put out, I'm not kidding you, this is according to Dr. Carolyn Borisenko, who's an organizational psychologist. The city of Seattle asked its white employees to voluntarily spend a day off in a training about their internalized racial superiority.
I broke the story that led to the first ever federal lawsuit against critical race theory in the schools. I broke the Coke Be Less White story, one of the biggest anti-woke stories of all time. It got over 30 million views. Coca-Cola's corporate headquarters even had to change their outgoing voicemail.
Throughout the past few days, you may have seen inaccurate reporting on the content of our recently launched diversity, equity, and inclusion training program.
I exposed the schools in Burlington, Vermont for grooming middle school children live on the internet. They called me an unwoke cult leader for that. And the Vermont Human Rights Commission slandered me publicly as being a hate channel. I even got called a hero in Breitbart for exposing that the Washington Post was writing a hit piece on Christopher Rufo. I have broken story after story after story about what's going on in the public schools, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to autistic sex education, to the Department of Education in Michigan, literally training teachers all over the state how to groom children. I wrote a book called Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. I host a podcast all about fighting back, and I'm downloading all of my knowledge to you on my Substack, carlin.substack.com. The world is a crazy place. We are literally surrounded by cults on all sides. On this show, we're going to do a deep dive into all aspects of the culture war, and I will show you the dark, dystopian underbellies on both sides. Here are the commitments I'll make to you. I will always tell you the truth. I will always bring you receipts. And if you stick with me, I promise you will see the world differently. Welcome to the cult. Please mount that like button for me and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Well, hey, everyone. Happy Thursday. I am sorry to be a couple minutes late today. I was busy arguing with wannabe activists in the New Hampshire Liberty community who, instead of recruiting people to come and join us in the Liberty community, really seem more on hell-bent on driving people away. And those who know what I'm talking about know what I'm talking about. And I'm not ready to say more yet on the stream today, but maybe we will in the future. Porkfest, libertarians in New Hampshire. Well, I should say libertarians in New Hampshire, because it seems as though most of them are nothing more than conservative authoritarians who have no fucking idea how to actually appeal to people who are not part of their conservative authoritarian little high school clique. According to Autumn, Vosh name dropped me today. Why? What did he say? Like, honestly, Autumn, I have no interest in Vosh or anything Vosh has to say at all in any way. But if he's going to name drop me and I'm going to have to deal with the bullshit that comes with his audience, then I want to be prepared. So let me know what he says. Reagan says, I am not impressed with how Porkfest is handling a libertarian festival. I'm not impressed with how Porkfest is handling a libertarian festival either, if I'm honest about it. I am deeply unimpressed with the fact that in the past 48 hours, Porkfest and the woman organizing Porkfest, whose name is Constance Spencer, has called the people that I have been cultivating for 3 goddamn years. This is not the topic of today's stream, but I'm gonna get out some feelings. I am rather upset with the fact that Constance Spencer, the current organizer of PorkFest, in the past 48 hours has driven away not one, not two, but 3 members of my community that I have spent the last 3 years cultivating to get them to come to PorkFest, to get them to move to New Hampshire. And she did that because she considers answering basic fundamental questions to be a waste of her time. And she refuses to do it. And yep, Kino is one of the people that she has driven away. Now, Fish Addict, Kino, by the way, came to PorkFest last year, had a great time, was going to come back, was house hunting. Nope, the organizer of PorkFest considers him to be a waste of time and doesn't want to answer questions from him. Fish Addict also came to PorkFest last year, had a great time too. Already coming back. I don't know if I'm coming yet. I'm kind of like, we're going to see how this whole thing plays out. But Fish Addict is very curious about why the organizer of PorkFest, not Dennis, because Dennis is no longer the organizer of PorkFest. We love Dennis. Dennis sadly got driven away by insanity. And so this new woman is taken over. And we got another person who is curious about what's going on. We have a couple other people. Oh, yep, Murphy's Pool. Murphy's Pool was so excited about coming to PorkFest. Murphy's Pool couldn't get off work last year, and he wanted to come with his wife, and we were all really excited about it. And he was definitely going to come this year, and now he's not so happy either because, again, the organizer of PorkFest and apparently the Free State Project considers actually recruiting new movers to the state of New Hampshire to be a waste of time. And yes, I do have receipts of Constance Spencer, the organizer of PorkFest, saying that answering questions from potential new movers is a waste of her time when the entire point of PorkFest is to recruit new movers. This is the type of bullshit that I have been dealing with in New Hampshire for the past 48 hours. And this, guys, is why I stopped interacting with the liberty community in New Hampshire, because even though they brag about being the most hardcore liberty activist in the country, well, it is true that there are some amazing liberty activists here. There really are. I don't want to shit on everyone. Dennis Pratt, incomparable. Justin O'Donnell, second to none. A lot of people hate Justin. Justin knows fucking everything. There are incomparable liberty activists that live in the state of New Hampshire. Most of them are just, well, conservatives that were fooled into thinking that they were libertarians during COVID because they were conservatives that didn't like lockdowns and vaccines. And so they tricked themselves into believing that they were really libertarians because they didn't like lockdowns and vaccines. And now that the pandemic is over and they don't have to deal with those issues anymore, they are running right back to their conservative authoritarian roots because sadly they were never libertarians in the first place. And that is a very sad reality that I'm coming around to in my head right now. But that is not the topic of today's stream. That has nothing to do with today's stream. That's just me getting my feelings out on the internet inappropriately. But since my community is being called a waste of time, and the potential new movers that I spent 3 fucking years cultivating are being called a waste of time, I'm working out some feelings. It's my stream. I'll do what I want, all right? Let's see what Autumn says. Autumn says, in regards to Anna Kasparian, who was taking a right-wing turn, he compared Carlin to her and called Carlin that lady who left the Democratic rally on the left because people were mean. Yeah, so Vosh has basically shown us again that he has no fucking idea what he's talking about. That is not why I left the Democratic Party. It wasn't because people were mean. I left the Democratic Party because they don't believe in anything that I stand for any longer, because they basically became socialists. Now, for socialists like Autumn, that might not actually be a bad thing, but I'm actually not a socialist, and I've never been a socialist, and I don't want to be associated with socialists. And so, suck a dick, Vosh. I don't really give a fuck. Let's see. Murphy's Pool. Oh, if you're not at PorkFest, I'm not going. Well, here's my current thoughts around PorkFest. Let me just say this. I am going to tentatively book a site. I'm going to tentatively book a hotel room because there is a long time between now and June of next year. And it is my hope that PorkFest is going to get their shit together and that we will all be able to do the community meetup that we were planning on doing at PorkFest anyway. And if Constance Spencer and the Free State Project want to stop considering the potential new movers that Dennis Pratt and I spent 3 fucking years cultivating to get them to come to the event, to see New Hampshire, to experience the Liberty community in New Hampshire, if you guys want to stop considering them to be a waste of time and actually put on your big fucking girl pants and answer their questions, Constance, then we'll see how it goes. And I am truly hopeful that calmer heads will prevail, that someone will remember that we are supposed to be libertarians and that PorkFest is supposed to be an event entirely built around recruiting new movers to the state. That it is not supposed to be an event where conservative authoritarians are welcome, that it is supposed to be about recruiting liberty movers to the libertarian homeland and giving them an opportunity to explore what that means. If someone actually starts to get their eye on the ball again and people get out of their fucking feelings and start acting like adults, then we'll see what happens. We'll see. But there is a long time between now and June. And, you know, what they have shown us is that complaining on the internet is basically the only way we're going to get actually shit done. So it is what it is, what it is. Well, I think that Dennis is just tired of all the bullshit, and I would be too if I was in his shoes. Nick, oh, this is our 4th one, Constance. This is our 4th one. Nick Incognito, who came to PorkFest last year, who was at my site the entire time, stayed on my site last year, camped on my site, 2 sites down from the Body Freedom Village. Not buying tickets unless Constance changes her mind. I'm not sure if I should move to New Hampshire with the attitude that libertarians are having. That's number 4, Constance. That's the 4th new mover that you've driven away in the past 48 hours, Constance. Yeah. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about today because, guys, I have a surprise. Oh, is Mark in the chat as well? Yep, Mark also came to PorkFest last year. Yep, indeed. Anyway, moving on. I found a very, 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 very special treat on the internet today. I was trolling around as I usually do, just kind of searching on different websites, searching for different topics, searching for different events that we can infiltrate and spy stream and stuff like that. And when I was searching around looking for conferences that we might be interested in, I found this. This is from 2019. But it is a random PDF doc. This is why we always need to read documents, guys. This is a random PDF document from 2019 that is sitting on an open Google Drive. Let me show you what's in this document. What is in this document is every single conference targeted at queer and trans youth with website links. Now, again, this document's a little bit older, so it's not an updated and current list. However, it has a lot of conferences on it targeted at queer and trans youth and a lot of website links. And it's kind of like someone did like a lot of homework for me. And I basically have been spending my day. They've got older ones as well. Like, I basically spent my day going through a lot of these website links and saying which one of these are still up, which one of them got taken down, which one of them are real, which one of them are not. And guys, there are a lot of these conferences that are still live and running today. And so I basically found one of these conferences, which is at Lewis and Clark College or University. College. I'm not sure if they're a college or university. And it is a gender studies symposium. This isn't even Mary or Nancy. This isn't even the most epic thing I found. Listen, okay, sneak preview for what we're going to be doing tomorrow for happy hour. Hang on. Let me find the link because you guys are seriously not going to believe what I found for happy hour tomorrow. You're going to fucking die. Hang on. Where is it? Where is it? Oh no. I have too many links open on my desktop. Oh no. Oh no. Where did it go? Hang on. Not there. Maybe here. Hang on. Shoot. Hang on. This is going to be worth the wait, guys. I promise. If I can figure out what window I actually put this stuff in. Oh, I think I found it. I think I found it. Oh, no, 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 don't shut off computer. Don't shut off computer. My computer might shut off. If it shuts off, I'm going to be right back. It's doing a spinny wheel of death. I might get shut off and I might have to be right back, but I promise it's going to be worth it. Okay, I'm just waiting for everything to unfreeze. Oh shit. Oh shit, I may have out-memoried my computer. I feel it like working. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. Well, while my browser is deciding whether or not it wants to work. Let's do some other housekeeping real quick, guys, and hopefully my browser will just decide that it just wants to work like normal and nothing eventful is going to happen. But if I disappear, I will be right back. I promise. Don't no one go anywhere. Okay. But we're going to be watching today the keynote from the Gender Studies Symposium, which took place at Lewis and Clark College. Now you can see here they already have it ready to go for next year, but for the 42nd annual Gender Studies Symposium, can we just take a moment to wrap our heads around this? The 42nd annual Gender Studies Symposium at Lewis and Clark College. They've been doing this for a long ass time. They had a keynote address called Bodies of Knowledge, Gender, Sex, Science, and Medicine. And they have a video of that keynote. Let's read about this conference. The 42nd Annual Gender Studies Symposium explores the ways that science, medicine intersect with gender and sexuality to create knowledge and establish authority and shape policy. This symposium also examines how people experience these interactions within the institutions and ideas, a reality that is especially urgent today as medical science related to gender, sex, sexuality is routinely invoked and or ignored for different political purposes. We invite symposium participants to consider their beliefs and preconceptions. To that end, this symposium asks, how have racialized concepts of gender and sexuality been produced through scientific knowledge or research in medical practice? How does scientific knowledge affirm or challenge understandings of gender and sexuality? In what ways has science shaped our interpretations of different kinds of bodies? Hang on one second, just fixing a stream. How has medical racism affected ideas of gender and sexuality as well as systems of healthcare? How have scientific definition and medical diagnosis functioned as tools of authority? How have people resisted these systems to reshape practices and preconceptions related to gender and sexuality in medical institutions and science? Fun times. Fun times. James Jones says down arrow at the top right of the browser will show you a list of tabs. Yeah, the problem is, James Jones, I have about 8,600 tabs open on my browser right now. I have a lot of tabs open. Okay, I do. Thank you for the super chat. Let me see if this is working now because my other window's working. Why aren't you working, you goddamn thing? Oh man, hang on. Let me see. Okay, so the other thing that I found that is not working right now is okay, basically, sneak preview. God, I wish I could show this to you guys so badly. So effing badly. Why isn't this browser working? It is just like not. It's giving me the spinny wheel of death. Okay, the other thing that I found is a queer Christians conference. There was a whole conference dedicated to queer Christians. And there was one session in particular, and I shit you not, we're going to watch it for happy hour tomorrow. Does Jesus have a gender? Let me see if I can just look it up on YouTube real quick. Maybe I can find it on YouTube because it is on YouTube. Does Jesus have a gender? Hang on. Here it is. Oh, I found it. Look, I found it. I just searched for the title. This is what we're watching for happy hour tomorrow. It is from a conference called Queer Christians Fellowship. Does Jesus have a gender? And you can see here, look at all these. Look at all these. I almost had to watch this today. I was like, no. We're going to do the gender and sexuality one from Lewis and Clark College today because we're saving Jesus for tomorrow, baby. There are so many of these. Look at this. Look at this. Sacred transgressions. These are all queer Christian. Beyond the binary. Learning from pan and bi stories. Empathy practices at the crossroads. LGBTQ plus youth ministry and public advocacy. Planting seeds of good fruit. This is just like the effing best. I mean, come on. But that's tomorrow. You guys got to wait. Tomorrow we do happy hour at 5 p.m. You're definitely going to want to come for that. And we'll talk about queer Christians. But no, we're doing gender and sexuality symposium today. And the specific presentation that we're going to be watching is not that one, not that one, not that one, that one. Bodies of Knowledge, Gender, Sex, Science, and Medicine. And this is from Dr. Jules Jill Peterson, Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University, who gave this keynote last year, or actually earlier this year, I suppose. And the description is the legal principles of the right to abortion and the right to medical transition have been framed since the 1970s as analogous, there we go, to one another. Now that the overturning of Roe v. Wade has imperiled both, what other modes of relation activate ongoing histories of mutual aid and care? This talk takes up trans histories of transition and abortion as forms of vernacular medicine to explore what they can teach us in this moment about expertise, practice, and care that exceed legal and state blessings. Is everyone excited for what we're going to watch today? Oh, I know, Marion. The queer Christian stuff, this is why we have to save it for Friday. We need drinks. And Nancy says, oh no, good grief. Oh, this is going to be Nancy's birthday tomorrow. Happy early birthday, Nancy. 67-year-old tomorrow and Christian conservative, but adore you. Hurts my heart to see the perversion of Christ. I've seen some of this in print. Nancy, I'm glad you feel welcomed here as a Christian conservative. I hope I don't break your heart tomorrow with the queer Christian webinars, but it's better that we know what's being taught, isn't it? Naruti says, Carlin, I'm so sorry I got your hopes up. I feel like I failed you. Our favorite narcissist trolled me. Damn it, HG Tutor. He did. He trolled us all. HG Tutor made Naruto think that he was going to diagnose Candace Owens, or at least put her on the list for consideration. I swear to God, if HG Tutor doesn't put Candace Owens on his list for voting for who he needs to do the tutor scope for and potentially diagnose Candace Owens as a narcissist, which she obviously and clearly is, like, I will be so upset. I really will be. Like, Candace Owens is like a fucking layup. There is so much dirt on Candace Owens. There's so much evidence. Like, it would just be beautiful. But we still have, I guess you told me, because I'm not even really paying attention at this point, but like you told me that he's doing a fourth round tomorrow, so maybe there's still hope that Candace will be on the list. Yes, that's very HG of him, isn't there? Isn't it? Isn't it? Carlin, have you an X account? I'd like to follow you. Well, I have a Twitter account. I refuse to call it X. I'm Dr. Carlin B on Twitter. I will not call it X. I won't, ever. I have been on Twitter since Twitter first started. I am not calling it X. I refuse. Anyway, so guys, that is what we're going to be watching today. We're going to see what they taught at and look, this session, I didn't even notice this before. This is unlisted on their YouTube channel. Why is this unlisted on their YouTube channel? And do I need to download this right now just in case Lewis and Clark College decides they want to take this off the internet? Well, why not? Why wouldn't I want to download it right now just in case? Always download things, guys, just in case. There we go. Now, just in case they take it off the internet, because this is an unlisted presentation, we will still have it. Sorry. All right. Yes, they quietly send it to people because they don't want it in public. I wonder what was said at this conference that makes them not want to have it in public. Well, I guess we'll find out. Guys, that's what we're watching today on the channel. Now, as a reminder, if you have not yet subscribed to my Substack, which is Carlin, Karlyn.substack.com, now is a great day to do it. Last night I posted an update about our new favorite socialist professor because if you missed the stream yesterday, it was absolutely great. We found this Antifa conference that happened at what college? Hofstra. Hofstra. And this economics professor got up, and she's a socialist, and she defined fascism for us. And we're always looking for a good definition, and I think a lot of us have been wondering what the actual definition of a fascist is for the past several years. Every time the woke left calls someone a fascist, well, guess what? Yesterday, we got our answer. We got a very, very clear definition of the term fascism. And if you want to find out what that definition is, according to a socialist that was presenting at Hofstra University at an Antifa conference, you can head over to my Substack right now. I have a video of her saying the definition. I have multiple videos of her saying the definition because she kind of said it a couple times in her presentation. And now we have documented it for posterity. We never have to question what it means to be a fascist again. We now know that being a fascist means that you are a free market capitalist. That's literally what she said. You can see a video of that over on my Substack, Carlyn, Karlyn.substack.com. You can always subscribe for free, but if you do want to support the work I'm doing for $8 a month or $80 a year, because I am completely 100% funded by you, you can sign up as a paying supporter. You get access to a variety of perks, including 2 Zoom calls with me every single week on Mondays and Wednesdays. This Saturday, we also have Bitchcraft coming up at 3 p.m., which is a private Zoom where we bitch as we craft. All crafts are welcome. Knitting, crochet. Knitting is obviously the far most superior of all craft, which is what I will be doing. But you can even crochet if you wanted to. You can quilt, you can sew, you can draw, you can paint, you can do whatever you want. That's going to be on Saturday at 3 p.m. for all of my supporters in my Substack, in my locals, on my Patreon, etc., etc. We are also doing movie night on Sunday at 8 p.m. We are back to our 8 p.m. normal start time in honor of Reagan, because it is a belated birthday pick for Reagan. So happy belated birthday. And Reagan wants to watch Inception. So we're going to be watching Inception at 8 p.m. on Sunday in my supporter Discord. And this is also the 1-year anniversary of movie night. We have done 50 plus movies in my community over the last year. We have great discussions. We do trivia. We talk about the movie. We watch, a really good variety of movies. So if Inception isn't your jam, you can come next week. We're going to be watching something different. I think they want to do a Kill Bill marathon or something like that. That's coming up. We watch older movies. We watch newer movies. We watch a whole bunch of different stuff. And it is a great group of people. And you will always have a good time. So that's going to be on Sunday at 8 p.m. in the supporter Discord. And I hope to see you guys there. Also, please remember to check out the Unwoke Art Store, especially for the now Chinese knockoff. I have had like a dozen Chinese companies knock off this design. That's how I know that the Trump Indictment Victory Tour t-shirt is an amazing design, because China is creating knockoff versions of it. But you know what's different between the original, the only original version of this design, and all the Chinese designs that are on the internet right now? Well, number one, you're going to get like a really nice, soft jersey t-shirt with my design. It's so light, it's so comfortable. It looks great on women. I know women sometimes don't like unisex shirts, but it really like it has like a nice cut to it. So it works for both women and men. The colors look absolutely great. And the other and most important difference between my design and the Chinese knockoff versions is that my design is the only design that has every single Trump indictment printed on the back. This t-shirt was inspired by concert t-shirts that you get when you go to a show and has the tour dates on the back. Well, guess what? I've got the Trump indictment tour printed on the back of the t-shirt, and you ain't going to get that with no Chinese knockoff t-shirt. So you can find that right now in the Unwoke art store, along with all sorts of other merch like the All Tears Are Tasty line. I've got my All Tears Are Tasty tumbler right here. Isn't it beautiful? The colors look great because we don't just drink liberal tears on this channel. We also drink conservative tears. And apparently now I'm also drinking tears from the so-called liberty community in New Hampshire, who are little bitches that don't actually want to do any work to recruit people. I will drink their tears too. I don't give an F. You will find all that and more over in the Unwoke Art Store. And of course, all purchases do go to support the work I'm doing, and I do really appreciate it. All right, guys, with that long and meandering introduction out of the way, let's get down to our orders of business. Everyone, please go ahead and mount that like button for me. Mounting the like button mounting the like button lets other people on YouTube know to come and join us, and make sure YouTube recommends the stream. It really does help me out. Also, do make sure you are subscribed to the channel. If you are not already, I stream Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. on Saturdays at 6 for Socialism Saturday. And sometimes I even do late night streams and other things in between, just in case. So let's get this party started, guys. We are watching the unlisted, super secret keynote from this past year's Gender Studies Symposium at Lewis and Clark College called Bodies of Knowledge, Gender, Sex, Science, and Medicine. Let's see what this show is all about.
Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, we would like to say a land acknowledgement.
Land blessing! Land blessing! Hang on. I need to get a bingo card out. That was so quick. Which bingo card should we do? Should we do genderqueer bingo? Probably genderqueer bingo. Hang on. Genderqueer bingo card in the chat. God damn. That was a quick land blessing. Jan dominated the like button. Well done.
Acknowledge the history of the land Lewis and Clark occupies. Prior to the colonizers arriving in the area, the indigenous land of what would later be called Multnomah County was home to many tribal peoples. We honor the indigenous peoples of whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand: the Multnomah, Clathlamit, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watalala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and recognize that we are here because of them. We honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. For those joining us virtually, we encourage you to also acknowledge and educate yourself about the land you are occupying and the indigenous peoples who still remain both on and away from their ancestral homeland.
My name is Eli Bricknell. I'm a sociology anthropology major and a gender studies minor. Also one of this year's 3 co-chairs. We warmly welcome you to our first keynote event of the 42nd Annual Gender Studies Symposium. Our theme, Bodies of Knowledge, explores the way that science and medicine intersects with gender and sexuality to create knowledge, establish authority, and shape policy. The symposium also examines how people experience their interactions with these institutions and ideas, a reality that is especially urgent today as medical science related to gender, sex, and sexuality is routinely invoked and or ignored for different political purposes.
Thanks, Eli. My name is Sophia Reeves. I'm a biology major and gender studies minor and also a co-chair for this year's symposium. Tonight, alongside co-chair Julia Salamoni, we are overjoyed to present to you a keynote presentation by Dr. Jules Gill Peterson titled Transition and Abortion as Vernacular Medicine. Before this event begins, we have a few housekeeping announcements.
Okay. We want to remind you that we have a full schedule of events that we have planned for tomorrow and Friday. For more information on those panels and events, check our website. We also have social media, LC Gender Simp, SYMP, not SIMP. You all know the difference. Yeah, follow us on there. We have the link tree up with all of our information and whatever y'all need to know what's going on. But also, we'll be having a raffle for a book signed by one of our keynote speakers. Basically, you have to just do the Instagram Q&A thing every day, and you'll be entered, and we'll let you know next week sometime. There's also a art gallery in
Hang on, I have a question. So Raven's Poetry, the Trump Indictment Victory shirt, is actually available in women's cut. Just for people. I made a women's cut shirt. I haven't made a tank top yet, but well, no, there is a tank top. I'm lying. There is a tank top, but there is a specific women's cut t-shirt. No, Lewis and Clark College is not in Portland. Lewis and Clark College is, where is it? I think it's in oh, you're right. No, you're right. It is in Portland. It is in Portland. I'm wrong. You're right. That explains a lot, doesn't it?
in Watsek Library Atrium. It'll be going on for a couple of weeks, so you'll have plenty of time to look at it.
There will be time for questions and discussions after the presentation. As you listen, we encourage you to jot down notes, ideas, or questions, as there will be time for Q&A. If you're watching on Zoom, you are welcome to submit questions to the Q&A feature at any time. One of the co-chairs will keep an eye on those and share some aloud for Dr. Gil Peterson to answer. People who are here in person will be invited to raise their hands and wait for one of us to come to you with the microphone. Please remember that private recordings and photos of this event are not permitted. Photos from this year's Gender Symposium, Gender Studies
Why wouldn't they want recordings or photos taken of the event? Why is it all a secret? Why wouldn't they want people to know what they're teaching from the event?
Symposium will be available on our social media platforms next week. We also ask that you keep your masks on while attending this event. Tonight, Eli and I, along with our other co-chair, Julia Salamoni, are excited to welcome Dr. Jules Gil Peterson to campus. Dr. Gil Peterson is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. Her research specialty is on transgender history and the history of sexuality, focusing on racial histories of sex, gender, and trans embodiment, spanning both institutional and vernacular science and medicine. She explored these ideas in her first book, Histories of the Transgender Child, which delves into the largely ignored history of transgender children and examines gender plasticity and its role in the racialization of transgender medicine. That book will be available for purchase in the reception in the foyer after the presentation, and we invite you to pick up a copy then. While we were deciding who to invite to this symposium, we were immediately drawn to Dr. Gil Peterson, whose work speaks so well to our theme and the ideas we wanted to explore. Her work exploring the intersection of science and medicine with gender and sex throughout history made her a wonderful choice to speak here today. We hope you will consider how Dr. Gil Peterson's talk tonight places abortion and transition in a historical and ever-relevant present medical context. In addition to her teaching, writing, and research, Dr. Gil Peterson is also a co-editor for Transgender Studies Quarterly, contributes to the podcasts Outward and Death Panel, and is the narrator for the 2022 documentary Framing Agnes. She also writes a wonderful Substack newsletter called Sad Brown Girl, where she publishes essays on a wide range of personal, historical, and political topics.
Dr. Gil Peterson's work helps us to understand intersections of ideas about race and medicalization of trans bodies, and she provides us with context for understanding some of the most pressing and urgent questions under discussion today. We are honored to have Dr. Gil Peterson with us tonight to be able to listen to her knowledge and wisdom as it relates to the themes of this year's symposium hopes to explore. We would please join us in welcoming Dr. Gil Peterson.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Thank you so much.
Oh, oh,
I'm
oh,
just feeling really honored to be here.
oh. Well, did anyone else just have the same reaction I had upon hearing the voice behind the mask? Yeah, I think that some people indeed did have the same. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with being trans. I think everyone should live their best life. I was just a little bit surprised. I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, I would say this person. I think we all, I think that well, this just took an interesting turn, and I think that this probably has more potential to be an amazing presentation than we ever dare thought. Of course, we never want to question anyone's lived experience, and we want to be very respectful of everyone and their lived experience. And of course, adults can do whatever they want with their own bodies. And how lucky are we that we stumbled across this unlisted presentation on YouTube that Lewis and Clark College apparently wanted to hide from us, except I found a link to it. And how blessed are we to have this experience together today, guys? Please mount that like button for me if you agree.
Here tonight to be with all of you. This is like a packed room. And we got people on Zoom too. So I'm just feeling incredibly lucky and grateful. I just want to thank you all so much for sharing time with me tonight. Thank you so much.
Oh, really?
To Eli
Really?
and
You're ahead of
Julia,
all of us.
and Sophia for putting together this incredible symposium, and to Kim as well for inviting me and for helping make my visit possible. I've just been blown away by the session that I attended earlier today, and it's been a treat to get to know some of you already. Now, I'm going to share some real work in progress, some thinking that emerges out of a larger research project I've been doing for a few years on the history of do-it-yourself transition, or vernacular, which is to say everyday lay people's practices of science and medicine, but work that has felt for me impossible not to think about anew in the urgent political crises of the last several years concerning not just trans healthcare, but also the loss of right to abortion. And I, sort of been thinking a lot since last summer about where those two matters touch, and actually also why it's so hard sometimes to think about them together. And so this is some actually still very much preliminary thinking in that regard that I'm delighted to share with you. And I'm really looking forward to answering questions and chatting with you afterwards as well. So this is transition and abortion as vernacular medicine. When the US Supreme Court ended the constitutional right to abortion last year in Dobbs versus Jackson, you probably remember that a central plank of the court's reasoning was that, quote, "The right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. To rescind the right to privacy on which Roe versus Wade had been decided back in 1973, the court declared..."
You know what's odd? And I noticed this when I went to the Socialist Reproductive Justice Conference a couple months back, is that so I went to this reproductive justice conference at Hampshire College. I documented it on the channel. I documented it on my Substack, all this stuff. It was supposed to be a specific conference about reproductive justice run by socialists. And they spent half of the damn conference talking about trans people. It wasn't a trans conference. It wasn't a queer conference. It was literally called the Reproductive Justice Conference. And so I see them doing the same thing here with this presentation. It's like they're trying to, for some reason, and I would be interested in people's thoughts on this in the chat and like why they're trying to do this. Why are they trying to marry trans and abortion? The easy answer and interpretation is it's about bodily autonomy, but I don't think that's it. I don't think, no, I don't think it's intersectionality either, but you might be able to expand on that and convince me. I think the surface level thing is it's about bodily autonomy, but those of us who have watched these people a long time know there's always different layers to why they do the things that they do. And I feel like the bodily autonomy argument is way too easy. And I feel like it doesn't actually speak to any of the priorities that they have. So I'm just putting that out there for people to think about it. It gets them closer to surrogacy. I think that could be a very I think that could be part of it. Jane, I think that's a good idea. I think they're trying to latch onto women's rights because it's it's a more something base. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Myriad. I'm picking up the basic mise en scène, though. I don't think that they definitely try to hijack movements, and so I see that. Sterilization. No, they don't care about population. These people do not care about population. That's a right-wing talking point, not a left-wing talking point. I don't know if I would say that it's transhumanism, but maybe I could think about that a little bit. Established. Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense. Touche says, blur the line for people who are passionate about something specific, unite as a perceived similar movement. So basically, Touche, you're saying they're hijacking an agenda, which they do all the time, which I could probably I could probably get behind. Sorry, I didn't see that as an abbreviation, Miri. So I just didn't read it that way. So sorry about that. All right. So just something to think about. If anyone has any ideas as we make our way through the presentation, that would be great to hear.
That the due process clause of the 14th Amendment apparently had never been intended to encompass abortion in the first place. Because, and this is a quote from the decision, quote, until the latter part of the 20th century, there was no support in American law for a constitutional right to obtain an abortion, end quote. And the criminalization of abortion was, at the time of the adoption of the 14th Amendment, which was back in 1868, supposedly a consensus among the states. So the court actually declared Roe either ignored or misstated this history. And Casey, which was the other case it overturned, quote, declined to reconsider Roe's faulty historical analysis. Now, the court's sweeping declarations about history drew a lot of criticism, right? But including the criticism of the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians, who actually issued a joint statement in last July condemning the court's flawed interpretation and misrepresentations of both legal history and the actual history of abortion. So these two professional associations had actually submitted a friend of the court brief to the Supreme Court back in 2021 that reviewed the legal history and regulation of abortion from the era of English common law until the adoption of the 14th Amendment. And contrary to what Dobbs would go on to claim, the consensus of professional historians was that until the mid-19th century, actually, common law conventionally granted people quite a lot of autonomy over their bodies during a kind of open-ended length during pregnancy, because the fetus was not recognized as distinct from someone else's body until what was termed quickening. And if you've ever heard of that term, it's kind of an ambiguous moment. So laws regulating and criminalizing abortion really only slowly began to appear in the 1820s and 1830s when a professional class of doctors took advantage of sensational media coverage and unsafe procedures, like snake oil treatments, to consolidate their authority over pregnancy and birth. And so these two professional associations decried the codification of historical error as law, really endangering people's lives by twisting the past against itself. The legal principle of bodily autonomy and the right to privacy, they're both proving immensely vulnerable to being dissolved, rescinded, or outright destroyed these days. And the broader radiation of the Dobbs decision is already apparent. So soon after it was handed down, the state of Alabama actually updated its legal defense in a federal court case seeking to overturn a law banning gender affirming care for trans people under the age of 19. Of course, Arkansas was the first state to pass one of these laws in 2021, but it was enjoined, so it hasn't taken effect because the ACLU, has been challenging it in court. But Alabama partially succeeded in enforcing some parts of its law. So basically, Alabama was the first state to at least finally try to attempt to forcibly detransition some trans young people. But once Roe versus Wade had been overturned, Alabama started to draw a direct analogy from abortion to transition. So the
Oh.
state attorney general, Steve Marshall, wrote that no one, and he's obviously here riffing on Justice Alito, no one has a right to transitioning treatments that is deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition.
So again, God damn it. So I'm not suggesting that the right has caused them to try to conflate abortion and trans, because they were doing that already. But again, this is one of those circumstances where the right did exactly what these people wanted them to do, which was to conflate abortion and trans so that they can turn it around and use it against them. But I'm not suggesting the right came up with that idea, because again, I heard them conflating abortion and trans far before this, but I do think that that's very interesting.
And obviously already this year, we've seen quite a number more states actually successfully enact laws banning gender affirming care, starting with Utah. So in spite of all those rhetorical battles we hear so much
But
about,
this is an example, guys, of how they will take anything you do and use it against you. Now, you can't always control for this, because they're going to do it regardless. In some respects, you just have to kind of say, okay, well, they're going to take anything that I do and use it against me. But this is why we need to be careful about what we do, because oftentimes, like, things are done without that consideration, and then they end up blowing up in our faces because it was something really stupid that the right did or the anti-woke movement did, like the book banning bullshit, that then comes back to haunt us for all time perpetually. That was an unforced error. The book banning bullshit was an unforced error. Now, the Roe v. Wade stuff, I would argue, was also an unforced error. The right was baited into it because the right was so obsessed with their pro-life overturning Roe v. Wade that they ignored every other implication of continuing to pursue that. And they paid dearly in last year's midterms for it, didn't they? They lost the 2022 midterms because they took the bait, couldn't help themselves, and got Roe v. Wade overturned, and then thought, oh, no one really cares about abortion anyway. It's really not that important. No one even cares. This isn't going to be a big deal. This isn't going to cost us anything. And in fact, it ended up costing them everything. They handed record-breaking fundraising to the Democrats. They handed record-breaking college recruiting to the Democrats. They handed everything to the Democrats on a silver platter, and that is why they lost the 2022 midterms. And I don't want to hear anyone saying they didn't lose, because they absolutely 100% did. And I'll tell you what, the left is still running this playbook right now. They're still running exactly the same playbook. They are going to have record-breaking to recruiting on college campuses. They are going to have record-breaking fundraising because they're still running on abortion. So that was also an unforced error. You can't always avoid these things, right? But like the times that you can avoid them, sometimes you just need to take it on the chin. The right should have dropped the Roe v. Wade stuff. They just should have let it go. And I know there's a lot of pro-life people who don't want to hear that, but guess what? No one's going to force you to have an abortion. I don't want you to ever have a gun put to your head and be forced to have an abortion. But sometimes you need to let other people make mistakes, okay? Sometimes you gotta listen, man, in 2020, when I was running around with the walkaway campaign, do you know how many issues that were important to me that I didn't talk about because it wasn't the time or the place to talk about them? I had to put a lot of stuff that I cared about like on the back burner or just not talk about it. I never talked about the fact that I was pro choice. I never talked about some of the ideas that I have because they weren't relevant at that time and they were only going to be detrimental. You can care about things while also being strategic in your actions and knowing that the greater good has to prevail at some point. You have to be strategic. And if you aren't going to be strategic, then don't expect to win. Rottweiler, thank you for the super chat. The Roe v. Wade overturning meant it returned to each state to decide. What did the GOP do? Talk about a federal ban. Lindsey Graham gave them the reaction they wanted, and they're running with it. Well, that the whole states' right argument was never going to fly anyway, because most people don't understand what that means, and most people, regardless of how much they scream about states' rights, most people don't actually care about states' rights. Not even Republicans or conservatives. They don't care. They only use the states' rights argument when it's convenient for them. They don't actually care about it when it's inconvenient. But I will agree with you on Lindsey Graham for saying a federal ban on abortion. Well, fuck you, Lindsey Graham. You just nullified the entire states' rights argument. You're right about that, Rottweiler. Thank you for the super chat. Yeah, Tooch says politics is a game Republicans don't play at all, so they always lose. They'd rather lose and pat themselves on the back for taking the moral high ground. Ain't that the truth?
About how trans people should fit into the discussion of reproductive justice or abortion, I actually think the link is pretty unambiguous by those who are seeking to end both. As goes abortion, so too transition, and vice versa. Maybe it's the dual connection between trans and reproductive justice that make both of them such high-profile targets, but it also reminds us why struggles for reproductive and trans justice have to travel together. They're both targeted by the same logic. Of course, trans men and non-binary people also need access to abortion, as a matter of fact, which makes their erasure really high stakes and dangerous matter because it compounds on so much long-standing medical neglect and discrimination. But access to transition writ large is also bound legally and politically to access to abortion, quite literally by analogy under the law. So it's no coincidence that the same playbook that was used to incrementally destroy abortion rights over 50 years, which is to say tabling hundreds of unconstitutional laws in state legislatures year after year and working to stack the judiciary until it could be relied upon to produce disagreements in law for the Supreme Court to take up, it's no coincidence that that's the same strategy that has generated this year alone, since January 1st, over 400 pieces of anti-LGBT legislation, tabled by the very same politicians, funded by the exact same conservative groups. And so I don't think it's a coincidence either that Roe versus Wade actually fell in a political environment that was stoked by several years of moral panic around trans people and especially trans healthcare. That there's a symbiotic relationship between them, and it's proven nothing short of decisive. So I think the loss of the legal rights here, bodily autonomy, right to privacy, on which also gay and lesbian rights, the right to contraception, and a lot of other matters of due process depend, actually just kind of drive home the point to me about how narrow and weak the concept of individual freedom we get from the law really is. It imagines that the body is really a piece of private property, and the state can employ whatever reasoning it would like to rescind its blessing on abortion and transition.
Wow. Wow. Did you guys just hear what this... Now, this person, like, I'm not sure I understand their argument cohesively, because it doesn't follow that if the body is considered to be a piece of private property, that the state can enforce its will on the body, because the body is supposed to be private property and not the property, therefore not part of the collective, not part of the state. Yeah. But like, even the fact that they're putting that your body is private property into words gives me pause, because what is the number one goal of these people as outlined in the Communist Manifesto? I'm going to play it again. Don't worry. But like, what is the number one goal of these people as outlined in the Communist Manifesto? Pop quiz for the chat. It's to abolish private property. What does it say? What does it say when they're saying, well, they're just, they're considering, they consider the body to be private property. Let's listen to this again. I want to make sure I understand the argument being made, but
and a lot of other matters of due process depend, actually just kind of drive home the point to me about how narrow and weak the concept of individual freedom we get from the law really is. It imagines that the body is really a piece of private property, and the state can employ whatever reasoning it would like to rescind its blessing on abortion and transition, including rewriting history altogether.
so I think that I agree with Kenneth. This argument is stupid. This argument doesn't even make logical sense. But let's just roll with it for a second, Kenneth. I think that the argument this person is making is that the state considers the body to be private property of the state, and the state can rescind freedoms that it gives the person to do to their body at any time for any reason. I think that might be what they're arguing, which doesn't, again, this doesn't make logical sense. Because if the body is private property, then the state isn't granting rights to the private property because it's private property. So this might be a case where this person is making an argument that they don't understand. So let's just keep listening, because it sounds like that argument doesn't actually make cohesive sense and we might get more information.
Of course, that pisses me off as a historian, but
You're not a historian.
another
honey.
weakness I want to contend this evening is actually the concession of both abortion and transition to medical authority in the first place. Its defensive framing as simply healthcare, a privatized good mediated by the social role of the physician. And so if we're going to think about our responsibility and our opportunity in this moment to produce counter knowledge and further the struggle against these modes of aggressive state power trained on the body, I think we have to follow through and push our thinking about freedom much, much further than the law ever will, or the notion of the rights-bearing individual ever will. Because that concept of freedom is a negative concept. It's freedom from state intrusion, but it's remained fragile. It had about a 50-year run after Roe and was able to be overturned in part because it imagines the body as quite limited, as an isolated domain to be protected from the state, but the whole time had been forced into a gatekeeping and regulatory relationship with medicine. And I think we've sort of been falsely led to imagine that in some ways medicine would be a reprieve from state violence, when on the other hand, I think they actually go together. And even before Dobbs, or even before Arkansas and Alabama began to ban gender-affirming care, abortion and transition shared the root similarity.
They view the banning of gender-affirming care on minors as state violence. Why would they view the withholding of this is a pop quiz for the chat. Why would they view the withholding of gender affirming care as state violence? Any ideas about that? I have an idea about that, but I want to hear your guys' ideas. I want to see how much you've been paying attention. Why would this person view the withholding of gender affirming care to minors as state violence on those minors? Hello, Foucault. Well, they want kids to be state property. They want them to be. Well, yes, it does do that. Okay, here's the answer that I have. I think it's getting to parental rights, but here is the answer that is in my mind, and let me know what you guys think. They view the withholding of gender affirming care to minors as state violence because they believe and argue that if minors don't get the gender affirming care that they desperately need when they're minors, then they will literally die. They tell parents, exactly, Logan, ding ding ding, ergo you're literally killing them. What doctors tell the parents of trans children, and I do believe trans children exist. I just don't think that all children who say they're trans are actually trans. When parents bring their supposedly trans child to the doctors, instead of having that child go to therapy, instead of like working through it to really make sure that person actually has gender dysphoria, what they do is they say, this is what they tell the parents, would you rather have a trans child or a dead child? And if the answer is, I would rather have a trans child, well, then we have to do trans affirming or the gender affirming care immediately. Because if we don't do gender affirming care right now and put your child on the puberty blockers and then the cross sex hormones, then they will literally die. Do you want them to literally die? That's what they mean. It's emotional manipulation and it's gaslighting on a mass scale. And it is exactly Fish Addict. It is psychological hostage taking of these parents. And this person has just said the same thing in the keynote.
Of being technically legal, but practically out of reach for many people who would want them or want them both, which makes these kinds of legal rights incredibly hollow, if not actively a part of the race and class-based stratification of life chances in this country. So I want to dedicate my talk tonight to considering what the convergences of abortion and transition outside of legal and institutional sanction could teach us. Because even if we were going to roll back, even if tomorrow we could roll back every bad law, every bad policy, and every bad court decision that has imperiled abortion and transition, all we would really accomplish is reverting to a deadly status quo of legally endorsed healthcare that actually immiserated and constrained us all along, maintaining our vulnerability to political attack in the first place.
Does this look like a very socialist slide deck to anyone else? I know that's a weird question for people who don't watch socialism with me, but like, this strikes me as like a deeply socialist slide deck because it's like so minimal and weird. And that's like what socialists do with their publishing. This looks like socialist journals that we look at. Oh man. We Are Your Them says, I am thankful every day that I've never had to deal with this. I never even thought that much about this until 3 months ago. Oh, you're just getting started, my friend. Welcome. I've been thinking about this stuff every day for almost 3 years. For over 3 years now, actually. You're about to enter the circus that never ends. Get ready. Buy a lot of alcohol and some good drugs, my friend. We got a long way to go.
And also extending both market and eugenic logics in what Ruth Wilson Gilmore identifies as the organized abandonment of entire populations who have been determined to be undeserving of health.
Who's Ruth Wilson Gilmore? Who is Ruth Wilson Gilmore? Does anyone know? This person just quoted Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Who is that? Does anyone know? The answer to this question is actually very dear to my heart. Because Ruth Wilson Gilmore was one of the very first socialists that we streamed on the very first rendition of Socialism Saturday. Months ago, almost 11 months ago, we streamed a live presentation from Ruth Wilson Gilmore about capitalism from the Literal Socialism Conference in Chicago when it took place live. And that was the very first episode of Socialism Saturday.
Healthcare. So I want to spend some time with DIY histories of abortion and transition, particularly in their convergence
DIY
point,
abortion
just
and
to ask a
transition.
bigger
What could
question in
possibly
this
go
pivotal
wrong?
moment that I think a lot of us are asking, which is this: what kind of freedom outside of or bigger than the law, bigger than liberal personhood or individuality, might we be seeking when we seek out abortion and transition? What kind of freedom does DIY exercise or build that addresses the material struggles, not just against state violence, but also the eugenic arithmetic and planned neglect that doctors execute?
Planned neglect.
And how can
if they
we
don't
claim
affirm their
our
gender.
legitimacy, expertise, and authority in our communities and collectivities without tying our livelihoods back to state power or the social role of the physician and their cruel blessings? So these are some preliminary insights from my ongoing thinking about the history of DIY transition and the place of abortion in trans history.
DIY transition.
I've got sort of three short parts for you.
That doesn't
First, I'll
terrify
talk about
you.
the
I don't
history
know
of
what to
DIY
say.
transition.
Oh, good.
Then I'll consider the absent presence of abortion in that history. And then finally, I'll come back to this question about how we entwine those two histories together to answer some of the questions that I've just offered us. So the stakes are grave, but I promise we'll have a good time along the way. Speaking of which, part one, the estrogen smugglers. So, one of the most pragmatic, and it's been a week on Twitter for this conversation, so boy, am I happy to talk about it, but one of the most pragmatic, unorganized forms of DIY transition has always been giving yourself your hormones. Now, synthetic hormone medications were first developed.
Does anyone else find it to be a little, dystopian that at Lewis and Clark College, there is a keynote speaker talking about DIY transition? How old is this video? Well, let's take a look at the unlisted video on Lewis and Clark College. This is from March 15th of this year. So yes, this person is still wearing a mask on March 15th of this year. And by the way, this video, because it's unlisted on their YouTube page, and I found you the link, you're welcome, only has 39 views. How great is that? But yeah, this was like a couple months ago. DIY transition.
Brought to market in the 1940s. And trans people were right there at the very beginning, among the earliest adopters. But non-trans people have always been their largest consumers. It's the same hormones for everyone. The post-World War II era was sparked in the US imagination as much by these hormone tablets that were flooding some people's homes. That was about as iconic as the atom bomb in the 1950s. And so if we go and look at the burgeoning trans print culture from these decades, we'll start to get a sense of both of the practical popularity of DIY when it comes.
No, this was, hang on. This was the date of the date of the event. I will tell you explicitly because it's on their website, March 8th through the 10th of 2023. This took place in March of this year. It is on their website that I showed you guys earlier.
To hormones and also the class conflicts they ignited, a class rift that runs directly right into the present day, and certainly this week to twitter.com. So rumors circulated via the grapevine in the newsletter Turnabout in 1963 that some trans women were obtaining the livestock hormone, a diethylstilbestrol.
What? They were writing about this in magazines in the 70s. Do you know why the left wins? Do you know why the left is as far ahead as they are? Because they never stop educating people about their ideas. They quite literally never stop. They never take a break. They are always publishing something and writing something and teaching something and opening bookstores and opening book publishers and putting materials out there. They never, ever, 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 ever stop. And this is why the left is winning so badly. Because the right doesn't do this. The right doesn't publish as much. The right doesn't own bookstores. The right doesn't own media platforms. The right doesn't own culture. The right doesn't create this stuff. They don't do classes. They don't do get-togethers. They don't do any of this stuff. They do every once in a while a Republican meeting where they maybe talk to other Republicans for 15 minutes and then they have donuts and go home or whatever. But they don't do stuff like the left does it. And they don't know what the left is doing because they don't pay attention to what the left is doing because they don't want to look at it because they say, they're all mentally ill. That's all crazy. They're mentally ill. And they don't look at what the left is doing and they don't reverse engineer it. And this is why the left gets so far ahead of them. See, Jared, you are fundamentally misunderstanding what the left is trying to do. This is the problem. It'd be nice if people built themselves around higher ideals, service as something noble and virtuous, and not mass reproducing, completely self-absorbed, cry, bully, narcissistic culture. They are advancing their ideas. They don't have the same values that you do. They don't care about the same things that you do. They don't believe in the same things that you do. And while you're complaining about, well, they're making all these magazines with their completely self-obsessed, narcissistic, cry-bully culture, well, you're complaining about what they're doing. They're making another fucking magazine. They're making another fucking video. They're writing another fucking book. They're opening another fucking book publisher. They're opening another fucking bookstore. They're having another conference. They're having another event. They're having another training. They're doing this. They're doing that. They're doing the other thing. They are the ones creating. They're the ones creating. Now, you might not like the material they're creating and you might not agree with the material that they're creating, but the fact that they are creating is why they are winning and why you are losing. Rottweiler, thank you for the super chat. The scary part is it's not only a violation of parental rights, but DIY transition or DIY transition. Hormones without prescription is dangerous. There are people who can't take hormones due to health issues. They are dangerously irresponsible. Oh yeah, these people, Rottweiler, I have trans Marxists on video talking about how they take testosterone as a party drug. They're not just taking it to transition. I have them on video saying they're taking it as a party drug, as like a rave drug before they go to the club. I'm not joking. That was on Socialism Saturday, probably about 6-7 months ago, something like that. Jared, you don't get to define what is noble and virtuous for everyone. This is another mistake the right makes. You think that you get to decide values for other people. You do not. They do not share your values. They do not believe that your values are noble and virtuous. They believe that their values are noble and virtuous, and then they strive to achieve those values every single day while you spend your time complaining that they are not noble and virtuous enough. They don't need to agree with your values. All they need to do is create and they win. And now you're complaining that you're getting told why they win. And this is why you fucking lose, bro. I know you're a conservative because of how you're talking about them. This isn't even hard to figure out, dude. Because you're talking like conservatives talk. Thank you, Mark, for the super chat. I do appreciate it. And Mark says, conservatives say they are busy working and paying taxes and losing. That's exactly right. We have jobs! We have jobs! We have jobs! No one else has jobs but us! We have jobs! Exactly. Vince says, Carlin, could the real differences be that those on the left are permanently dissatisfied with the world as they find it, while conservatives may be dissatisfied but accept it as part of life? No, I don't think so. I don't think that that's true. I think that there are a lot of people on the left that are becoming actually pretty satisfied with the world they're creating. believe it or not. But I'm going to think about that one, Vince. I'm not convinced that it's true. Let me see. I am absolutely correct in my assessment. Bro, you must be new here. You must be new here.
Quite literally ordering them from the Sears Roebuck Animal Nutrition Department catalog. To the middle-class writers of Turnabout, this veterinarian scheme was foolish, not just on medical grounds, but astonishingly, they really printed this because it ran afoul of the Food and Drug Administration. Oh, shocking. Don't try to be your own doctor, wrote Virginia Prince, a prominent transvestite, a year earlier in her newsletter Transvestia. In a 1971 column in the newsletter New Trends, Sally Ann Douglas remarked that everywhere I go these days, I bump into gals who seem to be getting hormones from somewhere other than a doctor's office, that is. She called it a trend. And she wrote that, quote, most of them seem to be pursuing a do-it-yourself program of experimentation with various formulations of estrogen. This was actually a subject that trans women would often write into newsletters looking for advice on. But Douglas, like many of the other middle-class trans women who wrote these newsletters, dismissed DIY as reflecting a lack of courage. They would say it meant you were just shy, too chicken to go to a doctor, instead of it being a real practical problem of finances and gatekeeping. Now, by the end of the 60s, birth control pills were flooding the US, and they were a sort of attractive alternative. But birth control's hormonal composition is ineffective. It wouldn't really cause you to transition. And it came with a really high risk of blood clots, which it did for everyone back then because the dosage was just way too high in the 60s. But in another newsletter titled Empathy Forum, the columnist Jessie Collins summed up her point of view on these risks this way in 1975, quote, there's not any reason to take more chances than necessary, so stick to nature's own estrogens. But I think by that she probably meant Premarin, which was the most common cheap estrogen that used to be prescribed at that time, which was actually derived from horse urine. All right, nature's own. In 1978, when Douglas was serving as an editor of another newsletter, All the Social Femmes, she replied to a letter from a reader asking about DIY estrogen this way. I don't have access to unprescribed hormones myself, and I wouldn't put you in touch with the underground, even if I knew who the girls were, because they all cheat. By cheat, I think she meant that the underground stood to profit off of desperate trans women. But that was the central worry about most legitimate doctors too. So print culture like this really preserves the point of view of respectable middle-class, mostly white trans women on DIY hormones. It was easy for people like Douglas, who had the means and the money to navigate the medical model, to chastise anyone who thought DIY was simply more practical or frankly the only option they had. The historical record, at least in this written form, is very biased in favor of DIY's critics. The trans women who ran the black markets didn't have newsletters in which they could publish their side of the story. And considering that what they were doing to varying degrees was illegal, you can imagine they probably didn't want to write it all down. But DIY was straightforward and far less moralized in neighborhoods that relied on it, usually as a fact of working class, highly policed life. Angie Extravaganza, one of the ballroom performers made famous by Jenny Livingston's 1990 documentary, Paris is Burning, started hormones like this when she was 15. The doctor who sold them to her went by the name Jimmy Treetop, and he hung out at clubs where drag queens and femme queens gathered in New York. For $15, he would give you a syringe of estrogen and vitamin B12. I guess because that B12 can give you a little jolt of energy. And Extravaganza supplemented those injections with progesterone that she got from birth control, which is a really smart molecular combination that I will point out many doctors to this day refuse to recognize as just like a normal HRT regimen. Now, the DIY doctors like Treetop, who weren't trans women, were viewed by suspicion by their customers. But for Black and brown trans women who already faced chronic police violence, becoming a smuggler or an entrepreneurial doctor was not always an appealing alternative. Stonewall veteran Miss Major, who came of age in Chicago in the late 50s, remembered a doctor kind of like Treetop who had cornered the market on DIY for Black trans women throughout the entire upper Midwest, when racism meant there was just no point trying to go to a doctor's office. In the 1990s, she told the historian Susan Stryker in an interview, quote, "He used these shots. His shots were so potent that after he shot you in the arm, you went out to sit in his waiting room and would just fall asleep." Although she and her other trans women customers were very skeptical of the safety, she explained to Stryker that, quote, "At the time, you didn't ask questions. And to this day, I don't know what was in it, but I knew at the time it made me feel like a femme fatale." So what I've been able to reconstruct of this lay or vernacular medicine has come through these kinds of personal testimonies. When I asked one trans woman of color who had participated in an underground in the 60s and the 70s, smuggling estrogen that she bought in Tijuana Mexican pharmacies up to San Francisco, she just told me it was common sense. Quote, "Everybody knows. Everybody knows. We need more than our doctors." And then I asked some follow-up questions about what types of estrogen, what dosage, and how did you measure their effects? All of which she laughed off. Because as I learned in this interview,
All right, we got a super chat from Amelia. What personality traits do people carry that make them obsess over ideas like this? I know a few progressives who were shocked to find activists speaking like this publicly. What ideas are you referring to specifically, Amelia? Can you chat in a clarification? I'm just looking at just for normal chat. You don't need to super chat or anything. I'm just looking for clarification. What ideas are you saying this person is obsessed with that you're curious about? And I'll just give a second for that to come in because I know there's a slight delay between when I say something and when you actually hear it and when the chat works and all that. But I mean, but generally speaking, like people can become obsessed with whatever ideas they want, right? People are obsessed with weird ideas of all different variety, of all different personality type. It's not a progressive thing to be obsessed with ideas. Conservatives are obsessed with ideas all the time. Conservatives are obsessed with the pro-life movement that lost them the election. I'm just talking until I get some clarification from Amelia about what she's asking, but like that they don't stop. Oh, because they want to win. I mean, this is really simple. They don't stop working to fight for their ideas because they actually want to win. The right doesn't want to win. The right has no interest in winning. The left wants to win. Like, I mean, it's really quite simple. You're like, if you want to know why a person does something, then think about the logical end result of them doing that thing, right? The left fights for what they want every single day of the week because the left cares about winning. The right cries and complains but doesn't actually do anything because they don't care about winning. The right doesn't want to be left alone. If the right had power, they would use it to assert their will on everyone. The right is just as woke as the left. They don't want to be left alone. You and I want to be left alone, Kurt. I don't know that the right wants that though.
interview, these DIY doctors weren't trying to imitate professional doctors. The one doctor providing hormones in San Francisco at the time was, according to her, quote, "making money hand over fist," and had an office furnished by cheap plastic chairs from a drugstore. So it's not hard to imagine why trans women probably trusted one of their own over a doctor who is preying on their vulnerability for maximum profit. That brings me to part 2, how to do surgery on your best friend. We're about to find out.
Oh, good. Oh,
In the
good.
mid-1950s, after the former soldier Christine Jorgensen had told her story of traveling to Denmark for surgery, making her a household name, rumors, it all starts with rumors. Rumors began to circulate in private correspondence among trans women that some girls were willing to do anything to get what Christine had. Now, on paper, there was nowhere in the US in the 1950s to get surgery. And in 1956, a transvestite in Southern California named Edith Ferguson remarked in some personal writing that she'd heard a story from a friend of someone who had, quote, recently has induced emergency treatment by self-mutilation, i.e.
Hang on, got a super chat from Naruto. You know, in the grand scheme of history, all land is stolen. Well, I suppose that that's true to some extent, Naruto. Oh, yeah, the surgery stuff.
calling the ambulance just before slashing off his organs.
That's a bad
Now,
idea. Don't do
like
that.
the newsletter's warning against DIY hormones, I say we should read Ferguson's sensationalism through the lens of her middle-class suspicion that surgery just wasn't necessary to be a successful woman. Of course, why would it have been? In 1956, gender-affirming surgery was just not something all trans people saw in a positive light. And besides, almost no one had ever had it. Many from the generation who had come of age before World War II, like Ferguson, greeted the prospect of surgical transition with a lot of suspicion, although they were obviously fascinated by it. Now, behind these rumors about self-castration lies a fascinating but somewhat less dramatic story. Although many gender-affirming surgeries are probably too hard to attempt outside of a hospital setting, so I'm not instructing you to do so, an orchiectomy, on the other hand, the removal of the testes, which is a procedure that many trans women decide to undergo, isn't really that hard to do. In fact, it's likely one of the oldest surgical procedures performed anywhere in the world, dating back thousands of years. I'm a big fan of evolutionary biology, and if I were being transgender Charles Darwin for a moment, I would say natural selection said, we're going to pop these on the outside so that trans women can pop them out if they need to. Okay, so we have no official medical records to consult here, but there are stories that were held tightly knit in certain trans communities that are corroborated by oral histories, which together begin to sketch out a contemporary trans surgical tradition that developed at some point between the late 50s and the 1970s. So trans women could actually learn the surgical technique for an orchiectomy from a textbook, sure, but I think more often they had the tacit assistance of a sympathetic doctor. The legendary Alicia Brevard Crenshaw, who got her start as a performer at San Francisco's famous drag club Finocchio's in the 50s, actually teamed up with her roommate and best friend to do orchies on each other around 1960.
What?
In an interview in the 1990s, she said that she went to visit a doctor named Stiles, who was already prescribing her hormones. And she told him that she wanted to castrate her cat. Now, whether or not he knew what she was really saying, he started drawing a diagram of what an orchiectomy looks like step by step. And as she recollected, quote, while he was drawing it, I opened a cabinet and stole a syringe and some Novocaine. Now, Crenshaw had grown up in rural Tennessee, so she'd actually learned how to castrate animals at a young age. And she felt that adapting that knowledge to a person was kind of a reasonable leap. And so a few days later, she and her friend sterilized their materials with Lysol and a quick blast in the oven before setting up on a table in their home. They each took a painkiller and followed the doctor's advice to complete the surgery. After a kind of scary 24 hours while they waited to see if there were any complications, they went back to Dr. Stiles' office and told him what they had done. Apparently, Stiles acted shocked, gave the pair some penicillin, and told Crenshaw, of course, you can't breathe a word of this. I can't put this in the record. So sorry, Dr. Stiles, I just told everybody, but what are you going to do? All right, that takes us to part 3. Trans abortion and/as gendered care. Sifting through all the archival materials I've been working with from this era, as I have been for, about 5 years now, there's a conspicuous absence. If you go and look for the word abortion in the trans print culture I referenced earlier, you'll find it, but it's always in the form of analogy. After Roe versus Wade in 1973, trans people began to analogize the legal and political case for their right to transition to the bodily autonomy now underlining the right to abortion. And then in the 80s, after Ronald Reagan comes to power and the moral majority and evangelical Christian politics start to radically reshape American political culture, a really strong sense of solidarity emerged between pro-abortion and pro-trans activists. So trans people were a constant presence in the 80s and the 90s at counter-protests and in organizing, opposing aggressive and dangerous anti-abortion agitators who in the 80s started not just picketing clinics, but harassing and attacking abortion clinics, murdering providers, firebombing some of them, from Georgia all the way to Buffalo, New York. But in all of these decades of newsletters, manifestos, newspaper zines, and other artifacts from the archive that I've been spending time with, there's zero reference to trans people themselves needing abortions. The first prominent trans men's organizations and their newsletters, which arise in the 80s, don't make reference to abortion except as an analogy to transition. So its absence is really conspicuous because it's consistent. It's consistently there, only as an analogy. No doubt, stigma, silence, and fear explain a lot of that. The extreme pressure to heterosexualize transition and transmasculinity in this era, including in the organizations founded by and for trans men, really offered no incentive to talk about needing abortion access. Even Lou Sullivan, who invented much of the grammar for gay trans men in his writing in the 80s, doesn't seem, at least from anything I've seen, to have ever written publicly about abortion. And the selections from his diaries that were published a few years ago, although they go into great detail on his thoughts concerning transition and sex, don't mention the subject either. His landmark 1985 pamphlet, which you see an image of here, which has a very 1985 name, Information for the Female to Male Cross-Dresser and Transsexual, like many other materials from this era, suggests that once someone who is transitioning reaches an adequate level of testosterone, they cannot become pregnant, which is not exactly true, but it was certainly the standard party line from doctors at the time. So no doubt there were trans men in this era who, for a variety of reasons, needed access to abortion, but reconstructing their experiences in the archive we have access to is really challenging.
Hang on. Online subscriber is saying LGBT should be separate from the Q, queer. Pop quiz for the chat. And I agree with this. Why? We always need to be able to explain why in a clear and succinct way. Why should LGBT be separated from Q, queer? I'll wait for answers in the chat. Well, in the meantime, I want to say hi to people watching over on Odyssey and Rockfin and Rumble. Please make sure you are subscribed on whatever platform you're watching on right now. I do appreciate it. Kristen says, because queer is political. Exactly. Queer is political. Queer is political. Exactly. Queer is politically rebuffing the norm. Queer is a political movement. Queer is an ideology, not an identity. Queer is a political act. Queer means revolutionary. Exactly. Queer is political and it's being hijacked and it's being used. They're using it to hijack the LGBT community. Exactly. Well done, guys. The difference between LGBT and Q, well, there's a couple differences. One of the differences is that LGB and T are identities. Q is a far left political movement. They are not the same. They are not in the same family. Some might argue that trans is not the same as LGBT because LGBT is a sexual orientation, whereas trans is a gender identity. There is a case to be made there, but at the end of the day, they're all identities. Q is not a sexual orientation. It is not a gender identity. It is a far left political ideology. The other difference is that LGBT and T uphold the gender binary. They fundamentally believe that a gender binary exists. You cannot be gay, lesbian, or bisexual without believing that the gender binary exists. And if you are trans, then you are transitioning from man to woman or to woman to man, and that fundamentally upholds the gender binary, whereas the stated goal of queer is to abolish or dismantle or liberate us from the gender binary. And anytime you hear a queer person or a non-binary person, because non-binary is always going to mean queer, anytime you hear a person say that they are queer and trans, that is not the same thing as just being trans. Because, and this is the really, really confusing bit, and I understand why people are confused by this. When queer people are using the word trans, they don't mean transition. They mean transform. And I'm going to be providing evidence of that. I have a video clip, and I also found a conference today that provides very clear evidence of that. But that's the distinction. When a queer person says trans, they don't mean transition from man to woman or woman to man. They mean transform gender or transcend gender, because it's about abolishing the gender binary. That is something that we need to uphold at all costs.
Gene, when the entire possibility is disavowed, both due to social stigma and the way doctors cavalier.
Hang on. Tuj is asking a good question. What is your response to LGBTQ activists who define queer as just under the LGBT umbrella? I hear this quite often. It is because the queer movement hijacked the LGBT movement. And they did this a while ago, but it became particularly pronounced after gay marriage was legalized, because all of a sudden the LGB and even the T to a lesser extent, because the trans movement is separate, but like after gay marriage was legalized, like things were pretty cool. Right? That was like the last big problem. What happened after gay marriage was legalized is the Q came in and they hijacked the entire movement. So when someone says that queer is just under the LGBTQ umbrella, they are lying. Now, a lot of them are useful idiots though. So they don't know they're lying. And this is actually what they want, right? Because they want people to be confused about what's going on. What queer activists want is to abolish the gender binary, to liberate people from gender. They want to create a world of non-binaries, a world of theys, or of an infinite amount of genders, neither of which are man and woman, by the way, because man and woman uphold the gender binary. They want to get rid of all of that. That's what they want.
Clearly and ignorantly talked about transition, which they really didn't know anything about. And you might have noticed a contrast. All of these DIY histories I've been talking about so far center around the social and medical labors of trans women. And there's a relative quietness of trans men on the subject of do-it-yourself care. There are some really interesting historical reasons for this asymmetry that I think largely have to do with how gender is a vector of class difference. Let me explain what I mean. If we think of transition not as the expression of an inner gender identity, but a practical problem of downward mobility, I think we can start to sketch out some fault lines. Both trans women and trans men experience transition as downward mobility By that, I mean by choosing to live publicly as trans, you're locked out of the formal labor market because most professions historically have been gender segregated, and the gendered aspect of that labor is really important. Think about the difference between, say working in the lumber industry and working as a nurse, highly gendered. There's also widespread discrimination in housing and public accommodations and constant barriers to accessing welfare because of the challenge of coordinating names and ID documents. So all of that leads to downward mobility, a loss of wealth and status. But there's actually a gender difference in there that the concept trans, the umbrella term trans, or the prefix term trans obscures. It doesn't tell us about this at all. For many trans men, as historians like Emily Skidmore and Jen Mannion have detailed, there's actually a slim possibility that by transitioning, you might actually achieve some upward mobility, especially in the 19th century, because you're comparing life as a man, right, to being forced to live life perceived as a woman. For white or white passing trans men in particular, and we see this interesting pattern, moving away from large cities to small towns, putting on a suit, working a man's job, and marrying a nice woman could satisfy local community norms in a way that allowed many trans men to live relatively secure lives, at least until they were outed or had a run-in with the law. But even then, their communities would often, as Skidmore in particular shows, come to their defense and say like, well, he's a little different, but he's a great guy. For trans women, by contrast, transition is almost always a significant loss of status and wealth because it massively shrinks your work opportunities. Trans women have almost no work opportunities historically until like 1 second ago. And because of the high bar placed on passing and the complete lack of a culturally sanctioned category between man and woman, trans women were also locked out of the 2 contracts available to women starting in the 19th century. One is marrying a man, which is off the table, and the other one is severely underpaid piecework, being paid less than men, right? So other than this white middle-class cadre of transvestites I mentioned earlier, who strategically chose to only live part-time as women so that they could hold on to the capital corresponding to their marriages and jobs, otherwise trans women started to flock to large cities beginning.
Do you see like they retained their genders so that they could hang on to the capital of their marriage and their jobs. This person is a Marxist, flat out. Tammy says, I was wondering about the mass as well, so I double checked. I told you guys it's from March of 2023. I showed you the effing dates. Yes, the conference is from March of this year. I showed you the dates on the website. Thank you for the super chat, Tammy. Like, I already talked about this. Guys, socialist conferences today are still requiring masks. When I went to the reproductive justice conference a couple months ago, they required masks.
In the second half of the 19th century, and it was there in neighborhoods together that they founded a way of life that I would argue was built into the modern service economy itself, feminized labor. I'm talking about the only kind of job you can get if you're a woman down on your luck. Work as a dancer, a stripper, and a sex worker. And it's in that urban context that trans women begin to develop community based in the gendered urgency of their poverty. But that's also how communities formed and generations of trans women became their community's doctors. That's where this DIY tradition I've been describing comes from in the modern era. But it's also, interestingly enough, one of the reasons why trans women tend to be overrepresented in the archive and in trans studies. There's been much more fixation on trans women historically than on trans men, but that would be my guess as to why. So until visible communities of trans men emerged as organized and culturally significant, which didn't really happen until the 1980s and 90s and began in places like San Francisco. Until then, trans men's historical visibility is intensely structured by class. All the middle class white trans men who moved to small towns and blended in are not especially visible to us, but by design, right? Whereas working class trans masculinity actually did have a very lively home in the same urban communities where trans women lived and worked. I'm talking here about the working class bar scene, the good old gay bar, also the butch femme scene, which sat at the center of what people used to call, and I love this term, the gay world. We should bring that back. Really, from the 1930s to the 70s, maybe was its heyday. And it would be here, I think, that we could begin to actually see concretely the DIY trans tradition around abortion in particular in this working class context. So I'm talking about the mid 20th century gay world, the gay life. I'm calling upon something like what Leslie Feinberg describes in Buffalo, New York, and Stone Butch Blues. If you've read that novel, you might remember that the social world in which it takes place is one where gay men, butch and femme lesbians, some of those butches are trans masculine, trans women, and every kind of sex worker go to the same bars. And because they're in the same room with one another at bars, they share the same struggle as poor gay and trans people. In a 1994 interview, Feinberg explained the historical situation of the novel really elegantly. So here's a quote. "We live in a society in which working people have to have a job in order to survive. If you are marginalized by that society or unemployed during a recession, you have to find a way to eat and live. Many people forced to the edges of the labor force or unable to find work, in particular women, youths, gay men, and transgendered people have been forced to turn tricks to survive. Like with drugs, illegality becomes a form of social control so that police can arrest people at will, and that threat will keep them down, keep them atomized, afraid of arrest, keep them from rising up. In this social world, one that Stone Butch Blues traces through its post-Stonewall upheavals all the way until the protagonist Jess moves to New York City in the 90s and falls in love with a trans woman, I think we get a signal clue about the gender dimension of trans care in this working class world that can help us fill in the gaps in the historical archive. So in New York, Jess starts hanging out
We
at
don't have
bookshops.
seatbelt laws in
First,
New
she's just
Hampshire,
reading
Autumn.
poetry and literature. Jess is a bit self-conscious about picking up any nonfiction or serious books, not wanting to, quote, discover I wasn't smart enough. But there's a women's studies section, most of these bookshops, and it starts to prove kind of too hard to resist, if only because it's filled with smart, beautiful women.
Although I will say that apparently the libertarians in New Hampshire are not responsible enough to not go to events that do things that offend their fragile sensibilities. Not all of them, but like a really whining, fucking loud contingent of them. There are no seatbelt laws in New Hampshire. That's deemed fine. But apparently the libertarians are not smart enough to stay the F out of events that are going to offend their fragile sensibilities without whining and complaining and harassing people on the fucking internet and trying to take over their events to make them kowtow and bend the knee to their conservative fucking sensibilities. Anyway, if you don't know what that's about, don't worry about it.
Here's a quote. At first, Jess is narrating, at first, I skimmed past all the words and pages about reproductive rights. I had no relationship to my own uterus. But I remembered how upset Teresa had been after I got busted in Rochester. This is a reference to a scene much earlier in the novel when a group from one of these bars were hauled into the police station and many of them were sexually assaulted by the cops. Teresa had been
I would never take on the job of organizing PorcFest for many reasons. Number one, I'm not a fucking conservative, and apparently that's what the Free State Project wants now, is not libertarians, but conservatives. Number two, I am not dealing with the level of autism that any organizer of PorcFest has to deal with. Number 3, I'm not fucking insane enough to do that job for free. I would never do that job because you quite literally don't get paid for it, and nothing is worth that level of goddamn headache. Number 4, apparently the whole event is a futile endeavor anyway, because apparently they're not actually interested in recruiting new movers. They just claim they're interested in recruiting new movers and then don't actually fucking do anything but piss off people that are potentially moving here because they deem answering their questions as a waste of time. Kurt, you don't even go to PorcFest. And I understand why you don't go, but you don't even go to PorcFest in the first place. Kurt has a good reason for not going to PorcFest. I'm not shitting on him, but
been upset, quote, because she couldn't remember when she had her last period. I never kept track of my menstrual cycle, but Teresa always knew when my period was in relation to hers. It suddenly made sense to me. She was afraid I might have gotten pregnant. The idea had never occurred to me. What would I have done if I'd gotten pregnant after a rape? I stopped skipping over the section in books about women controlling their own bodies. Maybe all these things that were so important to other women would prove to have meaning for me too. It's Stone Butch Blues's kind of working class leftist commitment to a kind of socialist realism here that I think gives us a key clue where the archive will be much quieter. The femmes who took care of butches and trans men also looked out for them when it came to matters they might not have wanted to think about or talk about openly. In oral history interviews I've done with trans men who came of age long before you could go to transition in San Francisco and find fraternity, a constant theme I've heard is the importance of femme labors of care. And I don't just mean femme lesbians, but also
femme
drag
labors
queens,
of care.
transvestites, and trans women who all offered social support in working class, bar-centric gay communities and who participated in care networks with butches and trans men. Trans femmes and cross-dressers would show up, ironically enough, to the first support groups for trans men in cities like Boston and New York in the 90s because they wanted to provide moral support and encourage the trans men they knew to organize and find each other like they had been doing for decades. They'd offer to go with them to medical appointments, provide care after surgery, and no doubt many of them, especially if they were sex workers, because sex workers historically have been well connected enough to get you an abortion if you need one for a reasonable price. No doubt many of those femmes offered to help any trans man who might have needed to figure out how to obtain an abortion, whether it was before or after Roe versus Wade. And so, still researching to find enough evidence as a historian. I'd like 30 or 40 or 50 examples of this before I feel super confident about it. But I wanted to offer it to you tonight because I think this story from Stone Butch Blues insists on trans not as a series of internal gender identities, but trans in its working class iteration as a DIY struggle across class and gendered hierarchies to provide one another with the collective resources it takes to live a good life. Without the sanction of the state, the law, the police, or institutional medicine, working class trans women and men have built remarkably successful and durable networks of care. They've provided one another with access to hormones, to surgery.
How many socialist references are there on this one slide? Working class, that means proletariat. Collective care, that means that's Marxist. It's about collectivizing care. That also, by the way, the collective care stuff relates directly back to abolish the family. They also have struggle across class and gender. That's Marxist. Every single thing on there's like 4 or 5 references like that are Marxist explicitly in this one slide. Struggle, hierarchy, collective, class. How crazy. But totally predictable at the same time.
to housing, to work, to reproductive resources, and yes, to abortion too. And so as we live through an era where both abortion and transition are intensely criminalized, that ingenuity, that expertise, that vision of trans DIY could be a guide. Because, the conventional wisdom of DIY is that it only happens in reaction to scarcity or that it's opposed to official healthcare. And I think those are both oversimplifications. As almost every story I've encountered during my research stresses, most trans people's lives are characterized by a mix of DIY sometimes and institutional healthcare other times, depending on the circumstances. The relationship is never static. But, and this is key, DIY challenges the monopoly on care through which institutional medicine, like the law, control not just who gets what, but the kind of life you're allowed to live on that basis. And so as feminists and trans activists struggle against the liquidation of the right to privacy, digging into these connections between DIY transition and abortion can tell us a lot. Both cases reject how medicalization and the state actually collude with one another to restrict autonomy. And I think DIY history suggests that one of the core lessons of trans feminism is that you can steal your body back from the state, but not to hold it as private property. You steal it back because the state power that polices and punishes your body, just like the doctors who execute its cowardly policies, is fundamentally illegitimate. DIY treats legitimacy as arising from the people whose lives are most affected by resources and care, not the abstract power of the state, not the abstract power of medical gatekeepers, all who think they have the right to make decisions for us. I really think this provides a vital counterpoint right now to the politically deflationary rush that I've been upset to observe precisely at this moment of bans and criminalization, where some are telling us we can restore access to abortion and transition by doubling down on them as quote unquote, just healthcare. You might have seen these lines. They're peddled not just by liberal political organs, but international NGOs, parastate actors like the UN. It's a ridiculous proposition in the United States. I don't think healthcare is a word people hold in very high esteem in this country.
She's saying that because
all
we
we
don't
have to think about when it comes to reproductive care, how the health of pregnant people and gestational mortality rates are astronomically high in this country.
Oh yeah.
No more so than for Black women. And that's entirely correspondent to the way the private healthcare system is designed to pick winners and losers in life.
By the way, so she just said, oh God, I can't believe I called this person she. This person, even I have an aversion to calling this person she. I'm sorry. This person, to be pronoun neutral, has asserted that abortion is particularly relevant for Black women. And so this is something I heard at the Socialist Reproductive Justice Conference I went to as well, and they were actually using Black women as an example of why they need to make abortion pills and at-home bathroom abortions more acceptable or more like accessible, because Black women can't afford to have an abortion in a clinic. So we need to make sure, because they make the stereotype that all Black women are poor, right? So because according to these people, not according to me, all Black women are poor, they can't afford to go have an abortion in the clinic, which is where these people really want Black people having abortions, because they want them all having abortions. I hope people understand that. But they have to provide at home bathroom abortion pills to Black people, because it's not equitable unless you provide a do-it-yourself bathroom abortion pill to Black people. That was essentially the argument at the Socialist Reproductive Justice Conference.
Life. And when it comes to transition, The defensive affirmation of gender affirming care as just health care has become even harder to swallow, as it's now being banned for children and teenagers as a prelude to banning it for adults. Because most trans people have never had access to institutional health care. And the field of trans healthcare, when it emerged in the mid 20th century, was explicitly designed to restrict transition. It was its job to limit access as severely as possible. That's the gatekeeping system invented in the 50s, but that remains largely in place because of private insurance. So even for trans people who live in states with legal access to care at its highest level of quality, finding a competent primary care provider, jumping through the hoops for care, all of that still involve outrageous, useless psychiatric supervision, out-of-pocket costs for many vital things like hair removal, only partial coverage for many surgical procedures that were declared medically necessary like a million years ago, right? And so the leading argument for trans healthcare is horrible today. I really mean this. The argument is that it saves lives, that it alleviates depression and other mental health indices. That's not the point of transition. You shouldn't have to feel happy on the other end. And none of that matters when the political forces seeking the end of transition precisely want a reduction in the number of trans people on this planet. Banning transition to facilitate death is their desired outcome. This is not a bluff worth calling. So trans healthcare's obscenely baroque structures and logics, I would argue, like abortion, reveal the eugenic and market-driven logics of US healthcare for everyone. The way that the social role of the physician is not just to diagnose and pathologize social differences or pretend that material inequalities are somehow biologically ordained, but actually it's their job to rationalize and enforce the deliberate stratification of the resources of life and freedom. Doctors and private insurers daily decide what kinds of people will be bio-certified as deserving of care on the premise that many will not.
See, guys, and I know a lot of people are making fun of this in the chat, like, because it is an outlandish thing to say, right? But what you really need to understand is this is what parents are being told when their children come home from school, declare one day out of nowhere that they're trans, and now the parents, because they want to be good parents and they want to do the right thing, and in some states, remember, in some states, it is now illegal to not get your children gender affirming care. You can literally have your kids taken away if you don't give them a gender affirming care, because the very premise is that if you do not get your children gender affirming care, you are literally killing them. And when parents who are trying to do the right thing, who don't understand any of this stuff going on, bring their kids to the doctors, they are being told that if you don't do this, you are literally killing your child. So it sounds crazy when you see it presented like this, that this is literally life-saving, but this is what people are being told. And there are laws being enacted that says you can take your there are laws being enacted that says the state can take your children away if you do not get them the gender affirming care, because it is child abuse to not get your children the gender affirming care. And now we're seeing directly where all of these ideas are coming from, because this person is a Marxist. I don't even need to look into this person to know they're a Marxist, because we watch Socialism Saturday every Saturday at 6 p.m. We know the language of Marx. We know that this person is using the language of Marx, and and this is why, guys, it is so important that you know where these ideas come from. These ideas didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It is all part of their Marxist cultural revolution. Everything. Now, this person hasn't come out and said, I'm a socialist, I'm a Marxist, but they've talked about collectivizing care. They've talked about universal health care. They've talked about social and class struggle. They've talked about the gender binary. They've talked about every single thing that we hear in transgender Marxism lectures. And collectivizing care is also an argument for abolish the family. So this is why it's important to listen to Socialism Saturdays, because once you start to learn the language and you see it come in a presentation like this, and you're like, oh, Marx, collectivism, collectivized care means Marx, class struggle means Marx.
Qualify. And for those who don't, they face not only neglect, being left alone, but criminalization and stigma as some kinds of failures, labeled the unproductive, labeled the unrespectable. The medicalization of gender, whether we're talking about abortion or health or trans healthcare, has colluded with and reinforced the rationalization of social hierarchies and the maldistribution of life chances. Why would that be the system that we think is opposed to state violence? They're siblings. The doctor and the Republican state legislator might don the role of antagonists and have a showdown at a subcommittee hearing, the clip of which circulates on Twitter later. But if we really look at abortion and transition from a materialist perspective, those two people are on the same side. There are appointed superintendents. They just have different ideas about what their job is in superintending. And so when some claim that all we want instead of criminalization is healthcare, I think we concede to the absurdity of a trans exception, as if there's really something mysterious or unusual about trans people's needs for the exact same hormones that non-trans people consume at much higher rates without nearly the same supervision. Or that surgery is only gender.
Wait. Did this person just make the argument that we should that we have to do gender affirming cross-sex hormones because non-trans people get the same hormones in different quantities, and so non-trans people getting the hormones in different quantities means that why wouldn't we provide these hormones to trans people in greater quantities? I just don't even know why that would be a problem. Like, I mean, and again, I don't care if adults are trans, I don't care at all, but like, is that really the argument being made that like, of course children can have trans gender affirming hormones, like cross-sex hormones, before they're of age, because other people take those hormones too, and that's fine. Let's just rewind a little bit, because I'm fairly certain that's the argument that was just made. It's always fun when they like slip those types of things in.
Those two people are on the same side. There are appointed superintendents. They just have different ideas about what their job is in superintending. And so when some claim that all we want instead of criminalization is healthcare, I think we concede to the absurdity of a trans exception, as if there's really something mysterious or unusual about trans people's needs for the exact same hormones that non-trans people consume at much higher rates without nearly the same supervision.
Oh, no, it's actually even worse than that, because they're saying trans people aren't even consuming these hormones at the rates that non-trans people are. And what I bet this person means by that is like, okay, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe they'll elaborate. But what I'm betting they mean is, like, I'm thinking of like women who are going through certain stages of life that need hormones, because sometimes during certain stage, and I don't have any experience with this, I'm telling based on what my mother taught me. Like, when you go through a certain stage of life, you need hormones because things stop working at some point. And so they give them like hormones to like, supplement or whatever. So this person is saying that because other human beings like consume hormones at much higher rates, then that means it's okay to give cross-sex hormones to trans kids. Yes, I was trying to be nice and call it the change of life, okay? It's not something I like to think about because I'm not there yet. Anyway, that would be my suspicion as to what this person is saying.
Or that surgery is only gender affirming when a trans person gets it, which is absolutely absurd. But of course, all of the states banning gender affirming care will still allow it for anyone who isn't trans. This is also why bill after bill include intersex exception clauses so that the very same procedures being taken away from trans youth who want them will still be able to be forced on intersex youth who may not want them or don't even understand why they're being imposed on them. I could go on, and I'm very happy to in the Q&A.
Oh, good, a Q&A.
It brings me to one final point. Institutional healthcare is not the solution to a political problem it helped invent and maintain. I actually think the history of healthcare is one of the reasons why we are in the situation we're in today. And so in the much more political spirit of DIY, I would prefer to say that trans people remain the experts on their lives, and alongside feminists who demand that anyone needing an abortion be treated as credible, period, trans people ought to command self-evident respect, and we do so when we are in charge of our own well-being. When you don't have to prove that you conform to anyone's external definition to be seen as deserving, you are freer to pursue what you want and need because you don't have to fear reprisal. And it is this version, this DIY version of autonomous community level responsibility and accountability that could strengthen and maintain continuous on-demand access to abortion, preventing any court from ever again rewriting history to serve its own repressive ends. Thank you so much. Well, thank you. Thank you for going on that long journey with me. And I'm very happy to answer questions. And I just want to say, there's a lot. It's a very JGP thing to layer a talk with about 100 ideas. So, digest, take a moment. But if you want to add and go in even other directions, there's a lot going on in the world. I'm happy to answer broader questions too, than even what I talked about in the talk. Yeah. And thank you so much for running mics up to folks.
Q&A is always the best part for people who are new. It's when they say the quiet part out loud.
I know, it's always a thing to be the first person, but it's totally chill. Yeah, who wants to ask a question? Oh, appreciate you.
You mentioned that trans women ended up being drawn towards more urban areas.
Yeah.
Whereas trans men ended up in suburban areas. Would you say that this is a undermining factor in like the history of ballroom culture in big cities?
Yeah, wow, what a great question, right? I mean, it's been a really interesting, I'll just say part of one of the reasons that I've been interested in this for a while now is like, after my book came out and I was kind of out on the lecture circuit, my number one question was like, why are there so many trans women in history and so few trans men? And I was like, well, that actually is an interesting question, right? And so I think these class patterns of the kind of work and settlement patterns that sort of obtain to each gender explain a lot, right? And so ballroom is a really important example of the ingenuity, particularly of Black and brown femme queens, right, who founded a whole system, right? Like actual ballroom practices, I think, they become very popular, sort of like in the public imaginary, but they're often treated very symbolically, where it's like, no, this is not symbolic. This is real competition where you have to earn, right, titles, and something like realness, right, is like a very powerful reward, but based out of real struggle. But also the kinship structure that's emerged out of ballroom, right, I think is a great example of like, it's not just a metaphor that Black and brown femme queens are mothers. They really are mothers, right? Trans women so often are mothers to so many people, right? And so ballroom is an excellent example of that, where there are whole systems for taking in street kids and runaways, right? Or people who, just have difficult relationships with their families and are looking for a way, right? So much of ballroom culture is also about preparing people to survive in the world, to build skill sets and to find work, right? And to find ways of gaming.
Hang on. What do they mean by ballroom? What is that referencing? Because we're not talking about ballroom dance people. This is some sort of subculture thing that I don't understand the reference. So if anyone understands the reference, please let me know. Beth, thank you for the super chat, Beth. Greetings, fearless leader, hail, comrades. As I always tell hubby, just because I'm menopausal doesn't mean you're not being an asshole. Beth, I really appreciate that. Oh, Touche knows the answer. Look at this. The ballroom scene is an African American and Latino underground LGBTQ plus subculture that originated in New York City. Thank you. You learn something new every day.
The political economy of the city to their own ends, right? And so, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons, why trans women have such a prominent role, though it's a contested one. And it's been taken a lot of time in some cases and in some places, right, for femme queens to get the respect they deserve, right? So there are, it's interesting how dynamics sort of reemerge even in sort of queer and trans spaces. But yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons why we see so many of the kind of quintessential queer and trans motifs and structures are actually like from trans women, right? It's not actually symbolic, it's literal. That really did happen, right? And it fundamentally transformed a lot of people's lives, like a lot of gay men, right, especially in working class cities, owe their lives to trans women.
So Yasmin is involved in this too. So Yasmin can educate us. Yasmin says you walk different categories and you have house families and you can win prizes like cash and trophies. And it's like a talent group with people you call families. Femme Queens is what they call trans women in ballroom, and she's a part of ballroom, so she understands. Thank you, Yasmin. I appreciate the clarification. Fascinating. Do you get big trophies like they do in like the beauty pageants? That'd be actually pretty cool.
There's a wonderful new book by a colleague of mine, Joseph Plaster, called Kids on the Street, which is a long study of the Tenderloin in San Francisco. And a lot of the street
Tenderloin
kids,
is gross.
who are gay boys who run away.
No offense, but like if you go to San Francisco, stay as far away from the Tenderloin as you possibly can, because Tenderloin is not safe and it's gross, and you're going to see a lot of people, and I don't mean any offense by this, you're going to see a higher proportion on average of crack addicts walking up and down the street shouting things and throwing things in the Tenderloin than like other I'm just saying stay away.
From home all over the country and end up in these neighborhoods would talk about showing up, getting off the bus in the Tenderloin as a 17-year-old,
maybe
not
it was
knowing
different back in the day,
where to turn.
It's gross now.
Walking down the street, and trans women would stop those boys and say, "Hey, honey, are you new in town? You can crash at our place tonight. We'll feed you. If you're ever in trouble, call us. We'll look out for you." And really would raise those kids in some ways, right? So it's an important aspect of a broader kind of LGBT tradition, and a really important role that trans women and femmes have played for a long time. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. We got mics coming from every angle. All right.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a question from the Zoom
Oh,
side.
fabulous.
I'm reading. They are saying, I so appreciate your perspective. I'm curious though about the incredible danger that DIY healthcare can pose to people, especially surgeries and abortion. Can you speak to that side of the issue?
Yeah, very good question.
Absolutely. Yeah. So,
Question.
this is I think a renewed conversation I've been seeing happening a lot, right? And it's like, I think one thing, if you really sit with a lot of I'll use the example of Crenshaw, right? Who did do a DIY surgery, in her, she's remembering this almost 40 years later. So take that for what it's worth. But she told the historian who was interviewing her, like, well, risk and danger are all relative, right? if you're living on the streets of the Tenderloin and the cops are on your ass every day and you have to turn tricks for a living, like, well, is doing surgery like really in the suite of your life, possible, considering the possible reward, right? Totally worth it, right? But she tells this really kind of macabre, dark, humorous anecdote, which I didn't include in the talk. She's like, she literally put a comedy record on the record player. She's like, I got to listen to something. And she tells the historian, you got to laugh. You got to laugh. It's an absurd situation, but it's real, right? So I like that response because I think it helps us reframe a little bit. You know, danger and risk are relative, right? But I don't think DIY is only dangerous or risky, right? And I'm not sure that it's always even inferior, right, to institutional healthcare. It might be for surgery. Like surgeries are hard. It's
What? Listen, okay, here's the thing. Back in the day, I'm not saying I'm advocating for this. I'm not advocating for this. However, I have more understanding of why someone 40 or 50 years ago would perform trans surgery on themselves in a DIY fashion. Okay? Because we're talking about a long ass time ago when people didn't really know about this stuff, when there weren't really doctors doing it, when it wasn't talked about, when it was more of like an underground thing. I'm not saying I agree with it and I think it's a bad idea, but I'm just saying that like I understand the mentality, and there is actually something to be said for what the story this person told of like when you're living in these really dangerous conditions, like the concept of danger becomes relative to the conditions that you're living in, right? So I agree with that. I also understand the inclination for way decades and decades and decades ago why a person might consider a DIY trans surgery or like hormones. However, times have changed. And even if you're in a state where this stuff is restricted, you still have way more access to safe and sanitized medical care today than you did 50 effing years ago. So I do not understand why in 2023 there is a discussion at a college about DIY trans surgery by an alleged doctor saying, you know, maybe there's a time and a place for DIY trans surgery and hormones. Let's just listen to that again.
real, right? So I like that response because I think it helps us reframe a little bit. You know, danger and risk are relative, right? But I don't think DIY is only dangerous or risky, right? And I'm not sure that it's always even inferior, right, to institutional healthcare. It might be for surgery. Like surgeries are hard. It's technical. It's an art, right? I always like to say this, sorry if there are any surgeons in the room, but I'm like surgeons, professional surgeons to me are like the only kinds of people I genuinely believe are like kind of psychopathological. Like you have to really have something wired in a certain way to be able to take a human being and be like, I'm totally chill with knocking you out and cutting into your body and also breaking you down into parts, right? And doing the aesthetic, careful work that good surgery takes. Like I appreciate that. Thank you, right? That's pretty hard to replicate, although I think not for orchiectomy, right? Now, when it comes to something like hormones, I really don't see why DIY is actually in any way more dangerous than going to a doctor, because doctors remain very, very, very ignorant about hormones. Like the first
Again.
although I think not for orchiectomy, right? Now, when it comes to something like hormones, I really don't see why DIY is actually in any way more dangerous than going to a doctor, because doctors remain very, very, very ignorant about hormones. Like the first
All right. I'm sorry. I need to clip that. What the hell? Is my program up and running? I don't think it is. Hang on. I just don't think that DIY hormones are really all that risky. In a lecture with a giant Lewis and Clark College thing on it. Hang on. I want to get, you know what I want to get? I want to get the unlisted thing on their channel. I'm going to put this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in the video and I'm going to put a little box around this unlisted thing. This is unlisted on fucking Lewis and Clark College's YouTube channel. We're doing this clip right. Okay, hang on. Clipping. Guys, mount that like button while I'm clipping this video. I do appreciate it. Wow. All right. Record.
surgery takes. Like I appreciate that. Thank you. Right. That's pretty hard to replicate, although I think not for orchiectomy. Right. Now, when it comes to something like hormones, I really don't see why DIY is actually in any way more dangerous than going to a doctor, because doctors remain very, very, very ignorant about hormones. Like the first doctor I saw to start HRT, I'll never forget this. It was not the worst thing she was going to go on to do to me, but she literally pulled out a piece of paper, unfolded, and she was like, I call this my cheat sheet. It tells me what hormones to give you. And I was like, so you're using, and she's like, another doctor gave it to me. So I was like, so you're not even really giving me healthcare. A piece of paper you got from someone else is giving me healthcare. And did she do a bad job? Yes. Right. You know, for hormones, right, you want to have like good quality hormones, but like, are they, you know, but if you can find out the quality where they come from, like that one lady in Brazil who's like, you know, supplies like everyone's hormones in the world, like great, right? So I think risk and danger are relative. That being said, they're not insignificant, right? And just because trans people are doing DIY or abortion is DIY does not mean it's better or inherently, you know, more progressive, and it can still be dangerous and unsafe, right? So I think to me, the question is about how DIY's sort of community network has accountability built in, right? And what something like consent looks like in that context could be really different, right? And, you know, I think abortion is a really important example. Self-managed abortions have a lot of different technical possibilities today, right? A lot more than they used to have. So that's really great news, right? But obviously, there's a different situation when people's sense of urgency is really high, right? If you're pregnant, like there's a, you know, there's a clock ticking, right? And also for transition, right? These are life and death matters for a lot of people, right? I mean, I really, you know, understand the people who say, you know, what do they say? What's the right phrase? Death before detransition, right? You know, but like wink, wink, we don't know who's dying in that scenario. You know, but I understand that, right? So it's like, of course, DIY is not inherently, right, free from danger or risk, but nothing is in life, right? So I think it's a question of who do we trust more to negotiate and arrange risk and manage risk and danger in a way that we feel good about, right? And I imagine local autonomous kinds of collectives are actually just more trustworthy, right, than, you know, someone who has an MD but received, as most, you know, people do in medical school, no more than 4 hours of curriculum about LGBT healthcare, which could mean literally anything. And probably 45 minutes of that was like, what's pronouns, right? And it's like, I'm not injecting pronouns into the body. So yeah. So it's a really important question. I think what it raises for me in this moment is like when we've had these legal and policy.
Okay. I think I got the clip. I guess I can always go back and make a longer clip if I need to, but I'm pretty sure I just got. Holy shit. This person basically was just like, yeah, doctors don't receive any education on hormones, and so basically, I mean, I'm not going to say it's without risk, but basically you're not any, like, your doctors aren't any smarter than you, and if you work with a collective of people, that then they probably know more than your doctors. And so, if you're just self-injecting hormones, it's probably going to be, just get them from that lady in Brazil that provides all the hormone. What the What the fuck did we just watch? I mean, like, what are people's opinions on what we just watched? Am I crazy to think that we just saw, like, the most? This is a keynote at a college. Wow, I just can't. I can't. This person just encouraged people, not, and she got into do it yourself abortion too, which is like a whole other thing. Oh, like, yeah, exactly, Reddit, exactly. Black market hormones for everyone. Just go to that lady in Brazil. It'll be fine. She provides everyone the hormones anyway. Oh, I already did clip it. Don't worry about it. Don't worry. Okay, let's get holy shit. This is why you always listen to the Q&A. The Q&A is always the best part because the Q&A is never, listen guys, socialists and people who watch my content regularly know this, but just in case you don't, socialists when they're doing presentations, they always prepare their remarks. They write a speech, right? Once they get to the Q&A, they are no longer prepared. They don't have like a preconceived answer that they can reference. And so they have to do it off the top of their head. And so the Q&A is most often when they say the quiet part out loud. Beth says, right up there with the worst of the worst. Yeah, Beth, I would tend to agree with that. Yes. And then We Are Your They says, this is just completely psychotic. What makes it more psychotic is she's telling medical students to do this. And I'm guessing it's medical students. I don't think these are medical students. These are not just these are not medical students this is a gender and sexuality conference. So this is like a general kind of like conference that this university has been doing for 42 years. So it's not just I don't even think they have a medical school, to be honest. I think this is like a liberal arts college. The Q&A lets the truth come out. That is correct. Wow. No, this is a liberal arts Lewis and Clark College is like a liberal arts college. It's not a medical school.
Policy forms of gatekeeping deciding what risk and danger were all along, and now those things are being banned. So we really have an opportunity to establish our own definitions of those, because the ones that were imposed on us have also been thrown out the window, and everything that's been coming to replace them is just made up lies, right? Like, anyways, I'm not going to rehearse what the lies people tell about abortion and contraception and transition, right? But like, that's like pretty much all we're getting. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting opportunity for us to come to our own more local definitions. So I really appreciate that question. Yeah.
So first off, I just want to say, like, I really appreciate the way you've worded everything. I think you're a great speaker overall.
Oh, thank you.
I did have two questions that are slightly off topic, but are connected to race and transgender people.
Oh, good.
First of all, I've noticed, like, in historical concept, like mentions of queer culture in America, especially San Francisco, often historians will use the terms black and brown. And I guess my first question is, does that involve Asian people? Because especially in San Francisco has such a culture of Chinese and other immigration of Asian people. It seems like often with these conversations, it's never specifically mentioned, especially of transgender people. So I guess I just wanted your insight on that, because I've never really gotten a clear answer anywhere.
Yeah, excellent question. I am I am South Asian myself, so I'm totally with you. Yeah, actually, San Francisco is a great example. One of the people who I did an oral history interview with is Tamara Ching, who is a really important advocate and community leader, for trans women and people with AIDS and gay and lesbian people for decades. She was also, hustling the streets back in the 60s and the 70s. And she's talked in a number of interviews with other people as well about the incredible anti-Asian racism of 1960s and 70s San Francisco. So there was a period when, the gay bars would not let, either Asian gay people, but certainly not Asian trans women in. And also, there's an interesting history, I think, about immigration and migration in general to be talked about here, right? Because that larger dynamic I talked about the downward mobility of transition, right, for trans women, particularly pushing them to cities, is also, I think, one reason why a lot of neighborhoods, the zones where trans women are also, there are tons of trans women who are immigrants, right? Asian
Tons.
immigrants,
Tons
Latin
of trans
American
women who are
immigrants,
immigrants.
right? Those are sometimes the people who, they're sort of experiencing, especially if they're undocumented, the maximum sort of version of downward mobility, right? Not only do you not have the documents you might need to work legally or to stay in the country, but also whatever documents you have are useless because they're not in the right name and gender, right? And the immigration system famously not very receptive to that, right? And so I think actually there is a really important history, especially in places like San Francisco, but also Los Angeles, also New York City, particularly of Asian American and also of Latin American migrant women who play an outsized role. So yeah, I mean, I think, part of the challenge is that the United States' own anti-Black history has not only produced a kind of, Black-white binary, but also has pitted, right, non-Black immigrants against African Americans at every turn, right? And so there's real complicated kinds of histories of how the class differences I'm alluding to sort of play out in terms of
Marxism.
different histories of race and ethnic.
This person is speaking critical race theory right now. If you aren't picking that up, they're talking about the racist history of the United States and blah 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 blah, and how the systems are designed to uphold some people and not other people. Blah 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 blah. But what you should be hearing is class struggle, race struggle, class struggle, immigrant, class struggle, Marxism.
Sort of policing and population management. So yeah, I think that's a really important aspect, and also something that I just think. I mean, I was just at a conference last week, and I was talking with someone who's working in Asian American studies and trans studies, and I was like, where's everybody else working on that, right? Like, so just to say, I know it's still a small field, but if that's an area you're interested in, other people are interested in, like, we really, really, really need more work in those sort of specific culturally literate kinds of histories too, because a place like San Francisco, I'll just say, right, a lot of the bars that I'm referencing, right, are, bars that are owned by white people in any case, but you could tell a completely different history of nightlife if you looked at, Chicken X bars in San Francisco, right? And that's like because a language and cultural barrier is really significant, but also racial segregation is really significant, right? So yeah, absolutely. When we think about San Francisco, especially because it's just like the gayest city ever, right? Like people have been moving to San Francisco to be gay since like 1830, 1840, well, more 1840, 50, right? And so it's one of the longest running kinds of queer and trans cities in the country. It should matter that that it is an intensely, right, it's central location for, tons of different kinds of Asian Americans, but also tons of different kinds of Spanish speaking, Mexican and Latin American folks as well. Yeah, really appreciate that question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to just ask a question, thinking a lot about like the political climate in Washington and in Oregon in particular.
Yeah.
And how, relatively progressive states that I think often, whether it's an institution like an education, higher education, or in other places, there's a lot of, I think, sentiment of like, oh, like you're safe here, right? And I think there's a lot less willingness to like engage in like how the legal framework could be applied in ways it's getting applied in other states, like, oh, that wouldn't happen here, right?
Right.
And so that's something, as I've tried to bring them up to folks, I feel like I've run up against that a lot, that folks aren't willing to have that conversation in Oregon or Washington, like as if it could never happen. But I was really, I think, energized to hear your talk and on the focus of like collective care and these kind of like really radical DIY, like we take care of each other approaches. But I'm kind of curious if you.
Anytime you hear the word radical, you need to think far left. Now, I'm going to say that with a qualifier. Not every person who uses the word radical is a far leftist. Sometimes they just grew up in the 90s watching Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, okay? Because it was like a little cultural moment. But I have heard, like, more than not, that if a person says the word radical, what they mean is radical far left ideology. And so it's another one of those indicators that you have to like kind of look for within context to see, like, is this person like a far leftist?
If you feel like these legal frameworks that folks have been fighting for, that have, I feel like only been open for a very narrow window of time, do you feel like it's worth continuing pushing for those, or do you feel like, because I know you said like trans healthcare, like the legal framework is just incredibly flimsy and weak currently as it stood. So I guess I'm just trying to figure out, like, do you think that is a place that folks should continue focusing energy, and like, what does that look like moving forward, whether it's a state by state or federal kind of approach? Because of things I'm kind of trying to think about, like how to focus energy and like where do we push and where should our time and energy go with these types of like national and state issues.
Yeah, well, it's a brilliant question. I'm like a try everything kind of person,
Well, that's
so like,
nice.
there's a lot of us, right?
Not
We don't
everything
all
kind of
have to be
person.
all in on the same strategies. So, I think legal fights can work as harm reduction. Like I used to, when I was in grad school, I was very like, well, law is just a form of violence. And But like spending time reading the work of people like Dean Spade is kind of like, really reminded me that there are ways to do, like, for example, abolitionist, legal and like police organizing that, like, where you actually do work through law, right? For example, or work through a local lawmaking body or state legislature. So I think, it's worth thinking about that. But you raised a really important question, right? I think there's been this kind of identity politics around blue states or progressive states, right? Being like, that could never happen here. We have really good laws. And like sometimes that doesn't even reflect anything. It's actually just a perception in want of a reference, right? But like I think also there's this like interesting faith in words written on a piece of paper, which is what laws are. And I'm like, well, didn't we just find out the hard way, like that's not really true, right? And I think the big problem for me, just on a practical perspective, is the function of federalism, right? Is like the federal United States, the federal state has often been used, right, to inflame and increase inequities, throughout the states, and like doesn't really, and often overrides the states all the time in ways that are like really, can be really horrifying, right? And so like, well, do we really not think there's going to be an attempt to pass a national abortion ban, and then all of a sudden?
The irony of this person is that they don't understand that they're arguing for states' rights and against states' rights at like the same time. And they don't understand that. I'm right about that, right? They're arguing for states' rights and against states' rights at exactly the same time. And in the same sentence. So we're not going to go back and analyze, because they don't understand their own argument here, and it's not fair to put this argument that they have obviously not thought through and don't understand. It's not fair to generalize this argument to all socialists, because this person doesn't understand the argument that they're making.
In all of these states with great laws, it doesn't matter anymore. Republicans are already introducing their first federal, I think it's a trans sports ban, but like, of course they're going to go after transition next, right? And then it's like those state laws don't do anything anymore, right? That's a problem, built into the US, right, to the system. So I think
they're
it's
arguing
worth,
for and against states' rights at the same
the thing
time.
you were expressing, right, this kind of like, well,
they're pissed off that Roe v. Wade got overturned because it sends the decision back to the states. And then they say, well, state laws don't even matter anyway because the federal government can just overrule them. It's like, bro, you gotta pick a side. Like, are you either for states' rights or against states' rights? And again, I think the overturning of Roe v. Wade was stupid on a strategic level from a political perspective for Republicans. They should have never gone anywhere near it. It will cost them every close election for the rest of their lives because they did it. But I understand the basis of it, which is a states' rights argument, which I do agree with. I just don't agree with it from a political, like, reality perspective.
that's not going to happen here. What bothers me about that is the sort of like, okay, so we're not doing anything in the meantime, right? And also, like, what is happening here, right? Like, okay, Oregon might have good laws and good healthcare if you're in a place where you can get it, but it's not free, right, for everyone. It's not available everywhere for everyone. There's still tons of gatekeeping. There's still tons, there's still a lot that we could be working on, even if we thought this was a really good situation compared to some other states. So I tend to think like, we can have multiple strategies, but I actually think a really key shift for me might be slightly different, which would be, I don't actually think we need specifically trans politics sometimes. By that, I mean, let's take this example that I've been talking about, right? Transition and abortion are like this under the law and politically, right? So if we're fighting for abortion access, we're also fighting for transition. And we have like many years of very successful feminist politics to draw on. That's why those feminist politics ought to be trans politics, right? In that sense, I think there's a lot of pressure for us to articulate some kind of like trans political project that will like, take care of the trans folks. But it's like this like, project of splitting up every minority group, which is a very American project. And so I often think like, well, what trans people need right now isn't really anything that has to do with being trans. We just need like public health care, the end of policing, right? The end of mass incarceration, right? Like we need access to a different kind of...
All that trans folks really need is Marxism right now. Can we just abolish everything and destabilize everything and get rid of prisons and get rid of the police and we want universal health care? Can we just implement socialism right now? Because that's what trans folks really need is socialism.
Labor market, right? Like, great. So does like everyone, right? And so I really honestly believe, right? Because I do want to say we have lost every single time in the last few years. I was just talking to a journalist today who was like, hey, remember when North Carolina passed a bathroom bill in 2016? Like everyone was like, oh, that's terrible. It got condemned. Like people got angry at North Carolina, even like capitalists, like corporations were like, we're not holding our big conference in Charlotte anymore. And then North Carolina repealed the bill. That's not happening anymore, right? And so like, that wasn't perfect at the time, but I actually think the real way to win right now, right? The solution is political, as in we have to do politics that outwit and beat the other side and their goals. And those folks now are full-on authoritarians and fascists. They're very hard to defeat,
oh, yes,
right?
They're literal
But the
fascists.
only way fascists have ever, well, okay, fine. There was like a war about it, but I'm not going to go there. But they can be defeated politically, right? And so I think actually the way I would see trans people succeeding in this moment is if the public, if there's a mass movement that claims trans...
Can we just note that there's absolutely no thought given to the idea that not all trans people are Marxists. Guys, do you want to know a secret? Is everyone ready? I'm gonna tell you a secret, okay? Just everyone gather around. I'm gonna get in real close. I'm gonna whisper. Everyone ready for a secret? Some trans people are conservative. I'm serious. Sometimes trans people are not Marxists. Sometimes trans people can be moderates. Sometimes trans people can be centrists. Sometimes trans people can vote for Donald Trump. Sometimes trans people can be Christian and religious. Sometimes, every once in a while, trans people just want to live normal lives and to be able to dress how they want to dress and present how they want to present, and they just want people to leave them alone. Sometimes trans people don't want to be used as political pawns to advance a Marxist cultural revolution. I know. It's crazy, right?
Trans people as part of what they're fighting for and understands that every progressive movement is fighting for trans people for real, not the like Joe Biden said transgender at the State of the Union. That doesn't do anything, right? I mean, like truly sticking their necks out and doing organizing, doing movement politics, trying to get the vote out, trying to sink fascist political, machines through, whatever means, right? But if there's a broad public that adopts trans people's issues as their issues, as material struggle, we'll win. I don't actually think we'll win if we split off and package up trans issues as separate issues, because that still relies on this logic where the majority has to give its blessing to us. And to be fair, that's what American liberalism loves, right? People love to feel like, sorry, I'm parodying someone in my own head right now, but I'm like, I learned about transgender people and their suffering and their plight, and it made me sad. And then I realized that I'm okay with them. And so I'm a better person now, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? That's actually this logic of how minorities are supposed to win rights, right? Well, it doesn't work very well because a lot of people don't like.
Hey, Yasmin. Yasmin is our resident trans Black woman, Autumn. So you can't question Yasmin because Yasmin is a trans Black woman. Yasmin, were you offended when I called this person instead of calling her she? I'm just checking in with my token Black trans person. Were you personally offended when I called this person instead of calling them she? I don't think I misgendered, Autumn. I called them a non-gendered phrase.
Like different minority groups, but also like, I don't need anyone's blessing.
No, Autumn. What I said was she, and then I said I can't call this person she, and then I called them this person. I literally called them she and then says, nope, can't do it. Doesn't feel right. This person. Sorry. Too bad. So sad. Rewind. It's on tape.
I need to make sure trans people have hormones and money and surgery. So like, let's fight for that, right? So I really think like my ultimate like kind of take in this moment is that in fact, like I want us, like one thing I'm really angry about is how much inside baseball is just raging everywhere. It's like, oh no, like the New York Times needs like a suburban white women to know what puberty blockers are. Like, no, that's not important. like suburban white women don't need to know about that. It's none of your business what things people are putting in their bodies. We need to get away from this sort of like, wow, like what is transgender, which is like still where a lot of people are in this country because they don't know that much about trans people. That's not important to standing up for trans people. Just go out and fight for healthcare, bodily autonomy, abortion, voting rights, right? And you're fighting for trans people, right? And then also like trans people should be there in those struggles because we'll make sure that, laws and policies shift and things like that, right? But that's my real sense is that we're probably not going to win anything unless we go that big because the forces trained on us are that big. Christian fundamentalism, like, is a big project. They got big plans, right? People trying to end democracy in the United States got big plans.
They have no plans.
People who want to, like, who are like, yeah, let's default on the debt and cause like a rapturous, apocalypse because like maybe the rapture will be triggered. They got big plans.
What exactly do these people think is going to happen if we default on the debt? because we are, I hate to break it to everyone, we are, and I know this is not the topic of this presentation, but like, do they think the sky is going to fall? Because we're going to default on the debt someday. You can't just keep raising the limit on the credit card bill infinitely. And we've been raising the limit on the credit card bill for a good damn long time. We are going to default on the debt someday. It is just going to happen. And honestly, just best to get it done sooner rather than later and acknowledge it.
Right? Those are not my plans, but where are our big plans, right? Our plans can't be, we got good laws in Oregon. So what? Every trans person in America has to move to California, Oregon, and Washington, and New York? That's not practical. Also, that's silly. That also is a technocratic solution, right? Where are our big plans, right? I think we really have to meet this moment at the scale of the danger that is directed at us. Yeah. So that was a very big, bombastic answer, but I really feel that. And like, I know probably a lot of you share this feeling. They're like, every day I wake up and I'm like, oh my God, what is happening now? Right. And like, it's really scary. It's really dispiriting. It's really crushing right now. Harm is already happening. People are dying. People have lost their jobs, lost their health care. People have been forced to detransition. People are fleeing their homes. People are running away. People are terrified. And what are we going to do? Because in that emotional landscape and that actual situation of terror, it is so hard to organize and imagine winning. But I think we really could if everybody adopts, abortion and, transition as fundamental, non-negotiable things that people are allowed to do, and we go out and fight for it on that basis. Yeah. Well, it is 8:30. Maybe that's a great place to end. Yeah. Thank you all so much. I feel so lucky.
We feel so lucky as well. I feel particularly lucky that we got that person on video on the unlisted keynote on Lewis and Clark's college YouTube page advocating for DIY hormone usage on a college campus to college students. What a time to be alive. All right, guys. Well, that concludes our stream for today, but I did promise you something very, 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 very special tomorrow for happy hour. So let me tell you about it. When I was researching today, going through that whole giant list of trans and queer conferences for kids that I found, I came across this website. This is called what is this the name of this conference exactly? This is a queer Christian fellowship conference. This is a conference that is going on it's not going on right now, but you can see they've scheduled the next dates for January of 2024. So if anyone is a queer Christian, I have a conference for you. But luckily for us, we don't Beth, you're going to be thrilled at this. Hang on to your hat, Beth. I'm talking about tomorrow for happy hour. So, luckily for us, we don't have to wait until January 11th through the 14th of 2024 for the next Queer Christian Fellowship Conference. Because tomorrow at 5 p.m. for happy hour, we are going to venture over to the YouTube channel for the Queer Christian Fellowship. And on this YouTube channel, they have a variety of video, all from last year's conference. We've got all the breakout sessions from last year's Queer Christian Fellowship Conference. And we are going to be watching a very special presentation called Oh, you can't see it. Hang on. You can't see what I'm showing you. I put it up in the wrong window. We are going to be watching a very special presentation called Does Jesus Have a Gender? That's what we're going to be discussing tomorrow. Does Jesus have a gender? This breakout offers a new way of connecting New Testament cultural concepts with contemporary gender concepts to help queer Christians in discerning new things about God, the things God is doing in their personal lives and in society more broadly. Ha 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 ha. Beth, aren't you thrilled? with this revelation and this find. This is possibly one of my best finds ever. Look, I was trying to show you guys this before. Look, here we have another one here. The Lord is near, exploring contemplative spirituality as LGBTQ plus Christians. Oh God, look how many great queer Christian sessions we have, Beth. Anyway, that's going to be tomorrow at 5 p.m. for happy hour. I hope you guys, it was, Beth, I didn't do it on purpose. It was a happy accident. All right. Beth, you can't put a presentation in front of me called, Does Jesus Have a Gender? And you can't expect me not to watch that, Beth. I'm only human, okay? It's going to be great. Beth, I adore you. You're my queen of the chat. You can't put, Beth, that would be like putting a $1,000 bill right in front of me and saying, Carlin, you can buy anything you want with this $1,000 bill. Just take it. Just take, it's yours, Carlin. Just take, I'd be like, I couldn't do it. I can't do it. Would be like putting a bucket of yarn in front of me and saying, Carlin, you untempted with the you can't do that to me, Beth. Anyway, that's what we'll be doing tomorrow for happy hour. Grab some drinks. Join us at 5 p.m. We're going to learn if Jesus had a gender or not. And of course, in the meantime, please make sure you are subscribed to my Substack, which is Carlin, KARLYN.substack.com. I'm going to be posting that clip of the DIY hormone clip in a minute. It's going to probably be about like an hour or so. Like, I'm going to get a story up tonight about it. But it's going to be great, guys. You can subscribe for free if you want to. But if you want to support the work I'm doing and keep me in business, because I am 100% completely funded by you, all this time that I have to spend researching and tracking down links on Lewis and Clark's college website to find the unlisted keynote on their YouTube channel, that's because you guys subscribe to my Substack and pay to support the work I'm doing, because I wouldn't have the time to do it otherwise. So $8 a month, $80 a year keeps me in business. You get access to a variety of perks, and you get to join us for happy hours on Fridays where we watch videos like, Does Jesus Have a Gender? That's all I've got today, guys. Take care. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see.